Welcome to the Visual Cast, coming at you from California. I'm your host, Alon Hammer, aka Rem. The Visual Cast is a hybrid podcast where we sit down with some of the best, most interesting, and most exciting visual artists from all over the world. We chat about life, art, visuals, software, hardware, systems, crystals, alien downloads, spirituality, and catalysts. It's essentially a massive nerd out. But the guests also do a set where we dive into their computer and get an up-and-close look at how they make art, how they perform art, or really anything they want to share with us.
The world is like a ride at an amusement park, and it's fun for a while. Some people have been on the ride for a long time, and they begin to question, is this real, or is this just a ride? And other people have remembered, and they come back to us and they say, hey, don't worry, don't be afraid, ever, because this is just a ride.
Developer and amazing visual artist, some absolutely fantastic interactive installations, permanent installations all around the world, and a really influential figure in the touch designer community. Welcome to the podcast, Lake Heckaman.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hell yeah. Super excited to have... Oh, hold.
Classic.
Super excited. Yeah, classic. Super excited to have you here. And I want to shout out Dan Molnar for connecting us. The great Dan. He's connecting me with all the awesome people. And I'm super happy and honored to have him as a friend and happy that he connected us.
As am I, in both accounts.
All right, Lake. So I'm going to start off with a quick scripted question, and then I like to start off like that, and then we'll get into more of a conversation. So, cool. Lake, you're a world-class artist, a touch designer guru, and a high-level developer. You have permanent works displayed all over the world, from museums to hotel facades and more. Your Patreon is chock full of digestible, high-level information, and you're a staple of the touch designer community and what it stands for. So, to start things off, as a magician of generative design and algorithmic art, what is it like invoking the ghost in the machine, and how has it influenced your life?
It's a good question. I think that, as you say, invoking the ghost in the machine is kind of the thing that you strive to do in all of these installations, and hope to most of the time, but I'm not sure every time. So when I feel like I have been able to do that, and there's really some magic happening, it's one of the best feelings ever. And it's pretty crazy a lot of times to be able to see this work and all these people interacting with it and feel just like not only the emotional connection to them, but then also the summation of all the work that you put into it kind of like paying off in a really fulfilling way. So for me, that is kind of like, what we're chasing as we're doing all this. And as far as for what it's done to my life and how it's impacted me, I guess I really can't understate that too much. It's been a very long and winding journey that I've taken to get here, which I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about. But being able to do this and kind of have my entire life and community and just interests day to day revolve around not only this technology that I'm very interested in, but also just trying to make people feel better, be able to have a nice time, engage, laugh. That is, I think, a pretty special thing. And so as you said, I think when we were talking earlier, it's hard to get too sad about Mondays when that's what we're talking about. So for me, yeah, it's gotten me to a place where I'm excited for the start of the week, the end of the last one, the beginning of the next one. And it's kind of all I can really ask for,
Hell yeah. Yeah, I mean, I totally feel that, we're very, very fortunate to be able to, in some ways, pave our own paths, in some ways kind of be ready to jump into any path that comes. It's kind of this long winding road of I don't know what the right word would be, but like this long winding road of experience and kind of grasping towards experience, learning and growing from it, and hopefully expressing it through some sort of art form. I love your nuanced and kind of like small thing that you said about making people's lives feel good. I think that that's like such an understated thing in art. It's interesting because most artists that I speak to and most people that are in this kind of sphere of immersive and interactive, there's like two groups. There's the people that are very spiritual and like, you know, the kind of like, oh, I'm trying to make the world better. And there's people that aren't necessarily that kind of like, you know, esoterically spiritual essence. And they're not really like in the forefront. I'm not trying to make people feel better, but they're good people. And you know that what they like is to see people enjoy themselves and smile and have a good time. And I think it's just kind of a really beautiful, like almost metaphor to how art is this kind of like beautiful two-way train or like Ouroboros is maybe like a better thing. Like, you know, it's kind of like we're feeding this machine and then it's kind of feeding us and it's like feeding other people. And it's like this kind of continuous kind of thing that you're creating something and it's being created for you and to other people and they're creating something. And it's like a very nice mechanism, you know, to making the world a better place in a subtle and sometimes very obtuse way.
Yeah, big and small, but always some way. And I think you said something that reminded me of a quote that I read at some point in the last couple of years. That was something along the lines of art is not just like a practice, but a way that you live your life. And I think that it can be cliched sometimes, but it's also a pretty good reminder every once in a while to just like remember that we're trying to do not just create the artwork, but then kind of like live in a manner that expresses what you're trying to express too. And 100%. For me, that's equally as important and something that I try to bring to the installations that I'm doing.
100%. And you do. I mean, your artwork speaks for itself. You know, I usually don't do this, but I'll just quickly give a little bit of a sneak of some of the things that Lake does. I mean, you know, just quickly browsing your website, just these very, very well picked out stills of kind of some of the interactive installations you have just invoke so much, you know, the movement, the kind of abstractness, but also this beautiful kind of like symmetry and color or light is very powerful. So, you know, good job on that one. I'd love to talk a little bit about, I love to find out where people come from, you know, how they grew up and where their paths kind of met with this kind of where they are now. So going back to Little Lake, you grew up in Pennsylvania. What was it like growing up in Pennsylvania? Give us a little bit of kind of intro into your life. And, you know, was there any early inspirations that kind of triggered your career now, or something that kind of connected to you as a young lad, as a young Lake?
Yeah. So the place where I grew up in Pennsylvania was Lancaster County. So it's kind of like South Central. I grew up on the coast of a river, the shore of a river. So it was a very rural childhood, lots of farms, playing in the creek, like that sort of thing. I wasn't so much artistic as I was very curious and trying to like tear everything that I could apart and put it all back together.
Gotcha.
And yeah, that was kind of my like hobby, creative pursuit at the time. And I didn't really think much of that for several decades, I guess, until a couple of years ago when I was building, God knows, whatever I was building. I was like, this kind of reminds me of a radio that I was taking apart like 12 years ago. Okay. So some nice, like, every once in a while I'll remember something that ties back into it. But when I was growing up, it was much more fishing, running around the woods, you know, like building forts and that sort of thing, which is great. I really like growing up in a more rural climate like that, especially because now I live in Brooklyn, which is the opposite. And it's nice to kind of have exposure to and both personal connection to yeah, the rural but also urban sides of things. I think it's a interesting perspective, and when I go home, it's always helpful to see my work from just like the viewpoint of not only Small Lake, as you said, but also just like in a more rural environment, and not necessarily the seat of urbanity, because we are, I think, in this space very often condensed in these urban centers, which is great.
Yeah.
But there's so much of the world that's not that. And I think that any art that is great is going to be able to speak to, you know, whoever comes along, regardless of what their specific background is. So certainly not something I think I'm achieving all the time, but something that I think about when I am back there, kind of in the more rural environment.
Nice. So do you go often and visit Pennsylvania? I mean, it's not so very far from New York, I guess.
Yeah, I get back for the holidays, maybe once or twice otherwise. It's a good place, but, you know, there's not so much going on. So
Right.
most of the time I'm like in New York, and then I go back and take a week or two here and there, just like catch up with the family, the friends that I have left, the dogs.
Nice. The dogs.
Have a
Got
good time.
You got to
Yeah,
see the
always
dogs
the
for
dogs.
sure.
Yeah.
Nice. So a very rural growing up in Pennsylvania, and then did you go to school for any kind of art or you know, university of some sort?
Yeah, so I went to school for, well, first I went as an engineer. It was a little hard. So I switched to math, which I thought was going to be a little bit easier. I'm not sure if it ended up being much easier. But I graduated with a degree in math and
Oh, wow.
finance. I did like a double major.
Cool.
And after that, I went straight
In
into Wall
Pennsylvania?
Street. No, in Notre Dame, Indiana, like the
Okay,
University
Indiana.
of Notre Dame.
Indiana.
Yeah.
Sorry, I stepped on a very important part. You went into Wall Street.
Yeah, that was like, did not study art, studied the opposite. And then with the math and finance, I was like, well, I got some student loans. What better way to pay them off?
Wall Street.
And yeah, it was an ill-fated choice, but I think in some way led me here. So, you know,
What did you do there?
all's well that ends well. I was a trader. So I was like
A
on
day
the floor
trader?
trading. Yeah, I was worked at one of the big banks.
Wow.
So I would buy and sell like, I don't know, hundreds of millions of dollars of euros in exchange for British pounds
Gotcha.
or like US dollars or yen,
Gotcha.
whatever it is. Long days, hard
Wow.
days,
That's
not the best
wild.
clientele.
That's wild. What a
Seems like a
crazy.
life ago.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, what a crazy insight into a completely different world. You know, it must have been very fascinating to see that kind of you know, grab the world by the bulls kind of mentality, or grab the bull by the balls. What is
Interesting
it? Grab the bull
is-
by the horns. What is the
I
saying?
think he grabbed the bull by the horns.
By the horns.
It was definitely an interesting mentality that, like, you know, when I started, I think I was gung ho, like, yeah, let's go get rich.
For sure. Why wouldn't you be?
Yeah,
Right? Like you're out of
Yeah, right.
school. Like what else is there? Like Wall Street is the place.
yeah. And I was there, and it was sick for like 3 hours, maybe. And it was like a very big evolution. I did it for about 3.5 years all in. And at the beginning, it was kind of really hard. And I was like, well, maybe I just don't like this because it's really hard. Eventually, it became less hard. I became better at it. And then I realized that I didn't like it because a lot of the people that I was around were just like
Shitty. Yeah,
not really the clientele that I wanted to be spending my time with. And most importantly, not people that I wanted to grow up into. So like as a 22, 23-year-old, I looked around and saw guys that were like my age now or 10 years older than me now. I did not want to be them.
right. You don't want to be them. Yeah. That's like a
Yeah.
very good like indication of like I'm in the wrong place. If like you don't have anybody to look up to, you know, or the people that you're looking up to, you're like, okay, these are the people I'm supposed to look up to, but I don't want to be anything like them. Maybe this is not the
Yeah.
right place for me. I can
Exactly.
relate to that for sure. So
Yeah.
okay, but growing up in a super rural environment was like going to the city like a very obvious thing to you? Was it very nerve wracking? Like what was the
As far as like when I moved here,
Yeah, I guess when you went to school, you kind of got the opportunity to leave home and be outside, but
yeah, I definitely hadn't left home very much before I went to college. It was kind of the first time that I spent like any sort of set time away from home. I'd visited New York, I think, twice at that point. Once when I was like 11, when my grandparents took me, and I fell in love with it. So like, I was 11 and it was New York, and we did all the horrible stuff. But the big buildings were shiny, and like they were not fields of corn, so
Right.
it was super cool. And that was great. And then I got to go back one other time as when I was visiting Columbia, just like on a college visit.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew that I liked New York, but that was kind of the extent. And then I went to college, and for the first couple of years, wasn't really thinking about where I was ending up. I spent a summer in Chicago in college, and that was my first like living in the city experience. And that was cool because it was also the first time that I really like lived on my own outside of either home or the dorms. So that was my intro to urban living, and it was Chicago, which is not New York, but it was a good kind of like starter environment for me to be in, and I really liked it. So once I realized that, I started looking for jobs in New York, and that meshed well with my goal at the time, which was make money. So one thing led to another, and a bunch of friends of mine and I moved here like right after we graduated, which was, I would say, more exciting than nerve-wracking at the time.
Right. Big city, you have your degree, you kind of have some sort of thing lined up. That is exciting.
I was on top of the world for like 6 weeks. Unstoppable.
And then you're like, shit, actually, I have to make more money than I thought I have to make, and I have to grab the bull by the horns.
Exactly. You don't get paid for the first like 3 months you work somewhere,
Really?
There's like pay cycles and like stuff that happens, whatever. It takes a while for like the first real payments to hit. And so I was running on fumes by the end.
Oh my gosh.
But that started the whole Wall Street trajectory, and eventually I paid off my student loans and got out like the next day. So
really, that was it. You're just like, I'm done.
Eventually, by that time, I kind of like realized, as you said, not a place I wanted to stay. So it was a matter of make it until I got the cash I need and then get out.
Pretty smart. Taking advantage of the systems that are there to be taken advantage of, so that you don't get taken advantage. Don't get taken advantage by them. That's always a good
as long as you escape before the teeth get in too deep,
before the horns get too deep, for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Super cool. So, okay, so you grew up almost like in a farm almost environment, like rural. I'm assuming not a lot of computers, not a lot of like artwork kind of going on there. You get to school.
No, sorry.
I'm piecing Lake together in my head. And then you get to Wall Street. So where is this amazing artist come from? What is the catalyst? I love this catalyst word. What is the jumping board of like, okay, you don't have it, like you didn't have a figure at home that you grew up with that's like an artist. You didn't have, a school professor that was like, do this art thing. So what was the push into this direction, and kind of tell us a little bit about that?
Very good question. And it's one of those things that I can now recognize it as a push, but at the time didn't really look anything like that. The answer is that when I was growing up, as you mentioned, it was pretty rural, and also the community that I was in was adjacent to a lot of pretty orthodox religious communities. And so there was not a lot of forward-looking technology, let's say. And so I was kind of inherently biased to just the sense of what's new. It's like out there. And also importantly, we didn't listen to a ton of music growing up. Almost none, really. And so when I first started driving, which was really by the time I kind of like got to college, that I was like driving off by myself, I started listening to music. And then I started having friends in college that were like had been into music for a long time. And so through them, I kind of got to dig into music and start to develop my own taste and what I was interested in, which turned out to be a lot of electronic music. And
the devil's music.
Yeah, it depends who you ask.
I'm joking.
Depends who you ask. If you ask the people I grew up with, they would definitely agree with you.
The people that I grew up with are the same. They would say the
Yeah.
same.
And that was definitely attractive, right? There's some allure to that. And so as I got deeper into college, kind of got like this group of friends that were all interested in the same music, the same like kind of micro niches, which, you know, at the time was like the beginning of super future bass and like kind of dubstep and stuff like that. But started going to a lot of shows, a lot of festivals, and doing a lot of mental expansion, forced conscious experience, if you will. And through those experiences, I started to realize that this deeper like sense of kind of like emptiness that I was feeling, this thing that I was like struggling to fill, started to somehow get attached to something creative that I didn't know how to define, but like I knew was there. I didn't think it was going to be music for me because I'm just not really musical. Never learned how to play an instrument when I was a kid, and I just knew it wasn't going to be music. A lot of my friends are also like pretty deep in the music scene, so they had that well covered. And so after my years in Wall Street, I was doing a lot of escaping from the day job that I really didn't like by traveling to shows. My like absolute favorite musical artist in the world was doing several tours at the time, and he was pretty small, so my friends and I would like travel once every 3 weeks, just like somewhere across the country to go see one of his shows.
Who was it?
Charles I, bass musician.
Yeah. Of course. Rest in peace.
Rest in peace. Yeah, so like the 3 years before he died, I spent most of that time that I wasn't working just like either going to his shows, going to other shows, like, you know, in the adjacent scenes, Super Task, Closey,
Nice.
a lot of those
Nice.
shows. And then also a lot more like techno, kind of like more club music. And through all of that, I started getting into visuals. I started seeing the visuals that I liked, the visuals that I didn't. And slowly, without really knowing it, started to kind of gravitate towards wondering how I can do this. Kind of in parallel, because I didn't want to do the whole Wall Street thing anymore, I taught myself programming.
Wow. During your time in Wall Street?
Yeah, like nights, weekends,
Wow.
mornings.
But not necessarily to make art, just to do something else, like
At the time, well, because so I learned how to program in school at like
Right.
a pretty
engineer math
like,
level.
the level, like if you take Spanish 1, you can speak Spanish, but like, can you really? I was like that level of software programming that I learned from like 2 or 3 classes.
Gotcha.
And so I wanted to take myself from that basis to like something I could get a job with, because I knew that I was very interested in that. It seemed like the future.
Yeah.
It was just like, it's got to be better than what I'm doing right now, right?
Gotcha.
And so, completely unrelated at the time, I was just like going to all these shows, experiencing all of this art, like ingesting a ton, and then teaching myself how to program. And I was focused on Python at the time, and JavaScript and like C++, and kind of like the more low level like build an application type stuff. I did that for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, got like pretty good, built myself some projects that was like, okay, I kind of wonder where this is going to go. And before COVID hit, like right before, my best friend sent me Jared Tarbell, who's this processing artist, who I think he was like kind of pretty early in the processing generative art game. But he was the first person that I had ever seen that like used code to produce artworks. And I never heard of processing before. And so then I was like, whoa, wait, hold on. You mean that I can just like do all of this and create images with
in your code that you're already learning?
I'm out.
Yeah.
And I spent the next year learning processing and just like jumping into that. And I was like, okay, this is sick. Starting to like understand how to express myself through a generative visual media.
Amazing.
And then I was searching around Cyphered on his blog. He's like another generative artist that has a lot of really good resources and stuff out there, which I learned a lot from back then. and he had this implementation of this thing called Touch Designer to scale up his system. I
Touch
was like,
designer.
whoa, what's this gonna be? And I was like, whoa, this is crazy. As soon as I figured out how it worked, I was in, and I, fast forward 5 years, 4 years, here we are. And I don't think more than a day and a half has gone by probably that I haven't opened it since. The first 3 years was a lot of really intense learn, build, and then kind of getting more into the doing freelance work, doing installations, more finished productions that I'm working on now. But yeah, I mean, once I found it, there was really no looking back. It was pretty clear that everything had led me there. And then I also got to pull back in some of the taking shit apart and putting it back together that I was doing as a kid, building the hardware side of the installations, rigging the Ethernet cables and all the good fun stuff that you got to go build.
System operation and kind of development. Wow, what an awesome trajectory. I love it. So many things there. I definitely want to revisit some of this stuff after your set, kind of get a little bit more into a little bit more esoteric conversation.
Sure.
But I do want to kind of talk a little bit about your, you kind of mentioned it, finding generative design and touch designer through these people and through that person specifically. The beauty, I think, of touch designer is that you can so many people come at it from so many different places, and I've been really fortunate to have these conversations with a lot of different types of touch designer developers, where some people come into it from the art perspective, that they're trying to solve, a problem in art that they can't solve with other tools, or some people come at it from completely development backgrounds. Myself, I totally found it by mistake, not by mistake. I was a very curious young lad, but, I kind of was upset with what I was learning, and then found touch designer and was like, oh, this is exactly the thing that I want to be able to do with the thing that I'm learning. And I just find it such an amazing environment and, ecosystem that can bridge so many things together. And the more you use it, the more you kind of expand it's a very psychedelic software, in the way that it expands your way of thinking about the certain things that you're working on, whether it's visual, whether it's data, whether it's development, whether it's software engineering. If you touch software engineering, you're now going to deal with the visual and the engineering and the and the development and the signal, and vice versa. And it's kind of this very almost synesthesia kind of idea of you touch one thing and everything kind of is connected. I just love it, and I'm sure you do too. So what is kind of your I guess I don't want to get too into touch designer yet. Actually, I want to pull back a little bit. So did you start doing visuals? Did you start with literally doing VJing? Were you VJing for a little bit there?
No, I thought about it back when I was getting into this, and for better or worse, I think most people fall into one or two camps. It's either start doing the thing out in the world immediately, right, and learn through doing that, or you sit in your cave for a while and hone the skill set, and then go out in the world once you feel ready. I was definitely more of the latter, so I spent a long time maybe living up to my own standards, I guess.
Interesting.
And that's important because I think for me, well, I've always had pretty high standards for myself, and so I just knew that that was the way it was gonna go. There was just no ambiguity there. But because of that, I had a lot of time to think about the way that I wanted to use the skill set that I was building kind of under the radar. And I decided that I didn't really want to go the VJ route initially because, frankly, I just didn't really want that to be the lifestyle that I was forced to exist in. I really love opting into that, but I just know myself, and I like to wake up early and get shit done if I'm not going out. So it wasn't really something that I wanted to start doing right I hope to get into it more, especially now that I have more of the rest of the installations under my belt, and just kind of like I've been able to do a lot of that. I think it would be fun to do more live performances and stuff like that.
It is very
But I
fun.
actually, yeah, I've gotten to do 2 so far, and they've both been exceedingly fun.
Yeah.
Like, great. So
Yeah.
definitely want to be doing more of that.
Nice.
But I actually started through getting kind of all of my information together and then condensing what I had taught myself into the tutorial videos that I kind of like wanted to find but couldn't when I was going through and doing the hard part. And as I was doing some of that, I had some people contact me about some of the stuff that I was writing about and talking about. And they're like, hey, we're doing projects that involve this kind of thing. Like, would you consider working with us? And one thing led to another. One of them actually worked out, you know, the right like need with me and the timing and everything. And I ended up going down to Colombia for like 3 weeks with a man who's now a good friend of mine, Gabriel Bicio. Lustix.
Yep.
He's a really phenomenal light artist. If people haven't, you should definitely look him up and check him out.
Yeah.
But he was working on this really cool project, and I was able to work on it with him as both a system developer and also generative artist. So he was kind of like creative directing, and him and I together were doing the system development. I was doing a lot of that, and then also had a couple pieces of generative work that I contributed to. So that was really cool. Like first, nice,
what an
high
amazing first introduction to the world of art and installation. Amazing.
Yeah, it was very cool, and I'm very thankful to have had that opportunity. It was great. It ended up being, you know, obviously way more than I thought I was getting myself into, as it always is. Yeah, but it worked out really well, and it's a permanent installation. It's still up there right now in Medellin, Colombia. It's open, I think, Thursday through Sunday in like the main tourist district. So if anybody's ever around there, check it out. It changes with the weather. It's pretty cool.
That's cool. That's that LED kind of diffused lighting installation?
Yeah, it's the very first one I think on my website. It's like an exterior
Sci-Fi Media Facade or Sci Media Facade.
Yeah,
Nice.
Sci is the name of the nightclub that these lights are on the outside of.
Cool.
Yeah. So that was kind of how I made the full transition.
Integration, the transition. Very cool. And so, okay, so now you're kind of getting yourself a name as a kind of installation designer. What was, you know, especially living in New York, I mean, you know, and this is obviously not like a dig at you or anything, but like, you know, there's a media artists are a dime a dozen in New York, especially, you know, and installation artists are one of those things. It's like, especially when it comes to big scale media installations, I think more often, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think more often than not, clients are going to go to a studio or a brand name, you know, Moment Factory-esque kind of thing. Very, you know, it's less likely that they'll go directly to an artist. Maybe the Moment Factory-esque will hire an artist. So how did you get yourself like a name? You know, how did you get yourself work? What was kind of your, way into the business, as it were? And kind of, you know, maybe give us a little bit of, you know, for anybody that's striving to get into the business, what are some really good ways that you made your way into it?
Yeah, I think you're right that most, especially larger scale clients, are going to end up going to a studio. But I think it's a growing space, and just it's kind of the new cool thing, right? And so there are, as far as I've been able to see so far, and from talking, there's just enough for the most part. And, you know, there are high-profile clients that'll be going with high-profile studios, but every once in a while, just the dates don't work, and somebody needs to fill in. And so, in my experience, it's kind of been combination of getting lucky and talking to a lot of people at any given time to just like, you know, be appropriately top of mind when this this doesn't work out, we need to find some replacement. And generally then, you got to be able to sell yourself and kind of
Yes.
land the whole proposal once you get in the room and actually get the call, which is something that I think I'm fortunate enough to have had a decent bit of experience on from the professional background. So a combination of those two things, I think, been able to be pretty fortunate, and I'm very grateful for that.
Amazing.
But yeah, I think word of mouth is hard to underplay.
Definitely. Do you think that your locale of Brooklyn is helpful with this, like kind of being in the mix of this kind of sphere of artists and I don't know if clients maybe necessarily, but like do you find yourself I can't remember the word with a C, not mingling, there's another word for it, like I guess mingling. Yeah. Do you find yourself mingling and kind of being in this environment with people and being like, oh yeah, I'm an artist. Oh yeah, I do this thing. Does that kind of generate work for you, or did, at least in the past? Now you're a little bit more well known.
Yeah, it definitely happens. More some places, less others. I would say like having shows in New York definitely helps a lot. Like when I've had my gallery shows here, because there you have people that come through that may have a friend who works at this company or that company, or like knows someone who's currently looking to book an experience for their like corporate gala or whatever.
And they're meeting you at your gallery, so it's like
yes. And I would say in my experience, it is a pretty hard sell if somebody's not already looking to spend X amount of money on some interactive installation. It's kind of hard to get them there cold, but if they are looking for that and you happen to be able to hit them with an interactive installation that's in front of them in person, I've had those convert at a much higher rate. And so for me, that's the benefit of kind of being proximate. But I think not to undervalue also the willingness to travel, because I think that's something that also, flexibility and being able to say, okay, I'm not doing anything next week. I'll be wherever I need to be. If that's in Korea, that's okay. If it's in Las Vegas, that's okay too. Like wherever it's at, we'll just be there and I'll stay for as long as I need to. And it's not comfortable all the time, but like being willing to do that opens doors that I think wouldn't be open otherwise.
That's really good advice. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously not realistic to some people, but I think that that's something that people should have in the back of their mind, especially if they're wanting to go into this kind of like, large scale interactive installation. And speaking about that, like, was there, besides for obviously having this opportunity with this installation in Mexico, was there any other reason you wanted to go into large scale interactive installation? Was there something that piqued your interest earlier on? Kind of like you kind of mentioned, you weren't really interested in the VJ route. You were interested more a little bit into like the traditional artist route. There's also like a little bit of a springboard of, okay, I have my works in a gallery. Where is the interactive and immersive kind of fit in there?
Yeah, so I think two things. One, as I was thinking through this, I wanted to find the sweet spot that would have commercial application as well as artistic application. And so going the installation route, let's say, versus just the VJ for like those two options alone, based on my research and like what I've come to see, is a lot more applicable to the commercial side of things, especially once you start doing larger scale installations, more complexity, and just like things that start to look a lot more like corporate client installations. That was important to me from the beginning because I wanted to make sure that I would be able to, pay some bills if I got into this. I had a job for a couple of years, but like 3 years ago, right before I did that Columbia installation, I quit that. And so I was like, if I'm going to be able to do this, like I said, I have to be able to just stay wherever I'm going for as long as I need to. And so I decided to jump in. But because of that, I also, again, wanted to focus on the installation thing because it was also an avenue towards the commercial side, which has been, I would say, about 50% of the time that I've spent probably on commercial work versus my own work. which has been nice. So it's kind of proven that hypothesis for myself a little bit.
That's really nice. That's a really nice mix.
Yeah. The other thing that is more important for sure is because I came to all of this through concerts and the club experience and kind of that's very different type of immersive, but no less immersive. And it was important to me to be able to bring that kind of temporal and spatial ability to lose yourself into the environments that I'm creating, and ideally in a way that makes it not so obvious that it's going to happen to reduce the guard. Because I find that, like, let's take the club experience, for example, is just too much for some people, right? Like some people are just don't want to be like in the environment, and so they don't go, which is fine. I don't think that everybody should be doing that, but I do think that everybody should have access to some sort of experience like that on their terms that works for them.
Totally.
And I think that interactive and immersive installations are a more approachable, for some people, way of getting that same type of mental experience, but also connecting with other people. And so that is why the large scale and interactive both are very important parts of my overall practice. Because to me, it's equally about expressing myself as it is creating these spaces, times, and places for people to be able to come have that kind of immersive, forget that you're your own person and feel like you're part of what other people are experiencing too. For me, that was very important. So for that reason and the installation route was pretty clear to me.
Super cool. Super nice, and really nice insights into these things. Cool. So moving on to kind of you do really awesome tutorials. You have an amazing Patreon. Everybody should check out Lake's after the podcast. Obviously, check out Lake's Patreon, and really nice offering of and sharing of your work. You know, this is kind of like I mentioned in the intro. The ethos of a touch designer community is kind of this: you give 99% and you offer 1% as a paid thing, and you'll be showered with all the riches that you want and deserve. And this is kind of, this is a very weird way of putting it. I don't know why I said it like that, but kind of like, there's an ethos of sharing and giving things out. And when Patreon came around, there was this beautiful switch of like, okay, I'm still going to give out most of everything, but then I'm going to keep a few things, and you can pay a few dollars a month and get those few things. And I think that it was a very beautiful thing because the people that were giving so much of themselves all of a sudden had the opportunity to be like, oh, I have a lot of value, actually, in like a good way, not in an ego way, but in like a way of like, thank you so much for your thing and for your time. Not like a little donation button, but an actual like substantial, monthly kind of recurring thing. And I think that the community picked up on it, and instead of like the whole community becoming this like behind a closed door paywall kind of thing, it continued being this very free for all kind of like offer with this kind of thing on top, which I think is really, really special and very unique to this community. I think that in the motion graphics community, there is a very distinct difference between here's free information and here's paid information. In other communities, it's also like that. And in Touch Designer, there's like this beautiful kind of like synergy of like people that are offering very high level information are also offering very high level information for free or as a community kind of thing. And I just love that. And I think that that's what makes Touch Designer really powerful and special. So what was kind of your what's your ethos behind the teaching and the tutorials, and what does it mean to you? And right before we get into your set here and see some of your work, kind of give us a little bit of a plug of your Patreon.
So I think I mentioned a little bit before, but the reason I started was because as I was learning all of this, the resources at the time had gaps that I just struggled to fill. And once I was able to find the solutions to those things, I wanted to kind of just create the videos that I wanted to be able to watch but couldn't. Because I was only able to teach myself both the software engineering from the very beginning, but also Touch Designer specifically to myself because of all of this information online. And I was always on a budget. So it was very important to me to have information that was high quality, but also pretty easy to access. I always liked when people had the videos that you could watch the entire tutorial through on YouTube without paying anything. And then if you wanted the source, then you pay. And to me, that always felt super fair. And so that's kind of what I try and do with all of mine. I like to reward anybody who likes and has the patience to follow along through the entire thing. I think that's phenomenal. But I also understand sometimes you just like need the code. And so that to me is something that Patreon does very well. And I'm very grateful for all the support that I do get through it. It definitely makes my like learning process doubly rewarding because also I get to learn stuff, right? But then I know that I can make it easier for somebody else to learn tomorrow or next year down the line. And I see that as only supporting everything. So I'm just happy to be a part.
That's awesome. And a really good explanation of kind of the give and take of the thing. Awesome. So yeah, I would love to jump into. Oh, I have one more question here. Kind of, I'm a little bit all over the place today. Sorry.
Sorry.
You're exciting me. How do you before we jump into your set and see a little bit of your work? I think it's an important question. How do you previs your installations? How do you, maybe even talk a little bit about selling them before they're even made?
Yeah, good question.
It's a big one.
I would say part of it is learning the balance of when to previs and when not to. I use Unreal for all my previs stuff, anything that I'm doing for real. It's great. The touch designer interaction with it is more or less seamless and is a combination of getting the 3D model from the client and like doing a quote unquote real previs, or sometimes when I'm doing an installation for a space that is yet to be named, I'll just find either a model of an architectural building that I have or just grab something, one of the free assets online, and just kind of say, okay, if this was the space, how would the installation look? What would it be? And use it both as like a little exercise for myself, but then also just like a way to more easily kind of show the mental path that I want people that I'm trying to sell to take. Because one thing that I've definitely learned, that I'm sure everybody else has felt very deeply as well, is that you have this like perfect idea and you can see it and feel it perfectly. And then you say all of these words and the person just clearly is thinking about the opposite of whatever you just said. And like, you just know that you failed and then your chance is gone. And
I've never had that experience. Like, what are you talking about?
And so, yeah, I think the previs is great because even if it's not their space, you're just like, hey, this is a space. Imagine if it was your space, it would be kind of like this. The flip side is when not to previs and sometimes too early in the process. I've done kind of too far in that direction, made the mistake of doing it too early. And
Really?
that can also be bad because one, it can just be a lot of work. And if it ends up being like, let's say an idea the client thought was final, but ended up being like the opposite of that and was actually just one idea that got, balled up and thrown away right after you finish the previs. Could be a couple of days of work that you don't really get back. Also, it can anchor the client to wrong ideas sometimes. If you don't
Like you might
have all of
hit
the
the wrong
information that
thing.
you need.
Right.
You might hit the wrong thing. It might just be a visual that maybe is like part of the way there in your mind, but not there enough for them to see the vision, or just like what the actual artwork itself is. And so it's a delicate balance, but sometimes I try and feel it out and I'll give just like a bank of visual references that are nothing but like 8 images that I will draw inspiration from, as I put it. And then if it's like later on in the process, I like to do like the full Unreal Engine previs with the nice lighting, and, make it all really polished.
Yeah. I mean, if they're paying for it, then obviously that's like a no-brainer, I would guess.
Yeah,
it's a
for
really
sure.
nice...
But a lot of times they're not at the paying for it yet part when you're doing the proposals and stuff like that. And so that's when it's tough to, lose 2 days on doing a really nice previs only to learn the proposal that you're doing is now for something slightly different.
Totally.
You're like,
or they're shopping around and you're one of 1,000 people that they're talking to.
Yeah, or they take your previs and don't pay you for it, and then you
And
find
they
an
go,
installation with that design later.
Oh,
Yeah, so
that's the
it's
worst.
the,
That's the worst.
yeah, it's just like a
They
tightrope, right?
use your previs to get another artist of like, oh, this is what we like. Can you do this? And you're like, oh, you motherfuckers. That's the
I
worst.
can't prove anything.
No, of course not. But I'm sure that's like, this is especially when you get into corporate, it's a dog eat dog kind of environment, and corporate people, I'm not judging all corporate people into one kind of category, but a lot of times all they care about is a number, especially if they're trying to climb some ladder of some sort, they want to make their boss happy. Their boss doesn't know anything about art or anything. They just want to see what did it pay? What was the result? How many people came through, et cetera, et cetera. So, a lot of times these people have no integrity, very little creativity, and you're kind of like holding their hand throughout the process, and they don't owe you anything. So they're like, well, thanks for your hand holding. See you later. You're too expensive, or whatever the reason is in their head. You're not diverse enough, white guy, so, which is also kind of something. But yeah, I think that's really smart, kind of like picking and choosing what the right time to put into, like what effort to put into it. I think it's synonymous with like proposals for installations, proposals for development in general. Like when you're sending a proposal that you're probably not going to get paid for, maybe if you have a really good contract, you'll get your money in retrospect for the work that you did, but not always. You have to really pick and choose what you're going to put your effort into. So that's good advice for people, I think, for sure. All right, so I think we're just about ready here for the set portion of our episode here. And I'm just going to remind everybody that after this set, we're going to do another conversation with Lake, so stick around. I will let you take it away. Let me know if everything is going the way that you need it to go. So here it is.
All right. So this first one that I'm going to go through is a work that I did for a corporate client recently, which I just going to kind of go through the big main pieces, and then I'll talk a little bit about kind of the artistic inspiration. But first, I will show you what it is. So this is an installation that is audio reactive at the beginning. Of course, the audio reaction isn't working right now because my speaker is going to the stream. But this would be a little bit more active. And then a person would come up and touch, and they would kind of kick off this whole experience, which would be moving pigment around this canvas. And
Lake,
depending on where they're touching, how fast they're moving.
Things got a little bit crazy all of a sudden. I think maybe too much screen sharing. Okay.
Maybe I'll do that. So it's just a stream.
Yeah, I could just cut to it as well.
Yeah, maybe
okay,
that's.
So
you can just leave it if it's.
Yeah. There we go.
Yeah. Okay.
So intro that one more time. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Much better.
So this is, the experience that starts when somebody touches the screen. So there's like a LiDAR sensor that was doing the touch recognition, and then pigments added that's different colors based on where they're touching, how loud the room is, how hot the room is at the time. And all of those elements kind of go into what this final composition is, which ends up getting printed out as a little physical printout card.
Oh, wow.
And that is one. And then, if somebody else comes, there's another one. And thus the experience repeats until there are no more visitors at this lovely client's installation. So it's a pretty simple project. I thought it would be a good one to go through because I can probably touch most of the elements.
Super cool.
And this is, I think, a good example of how you can use some of the installation ideas and concepts in more of a corporate environment. So this, I have my interaction talks. I'll jump into each of these, just at the high level. There are two sides to this exhibit. So you can imagine a triangular monolith with the base of the triangle kind of being up against the wall, and the two slanty sides of the triangle each has a screen on it. So there was one side and the other, each were operating independently. So there was a user session that was when somebody comes up and like touches. We have our generative artwork. And then I have these two toxes that are to output to the screen, very simple. And then this one, which does a save to file and then actually prints out to a physical printer that we had on site.
Wow. Was it random?
So,
Was it random the still that was chosen, or was it like
no, it was the one that they created. Sorry, so the experience or like the turn for each person that goes through is 30 seconds, and it ends in a still image that's the culmination of all of the pigment that you've added in your like 30 seconds. So let's say you like draw for a while, and then
takes a still,
kind of does the visual. It all coalesces at the end into a still frame that then gets printed immediately, so the person can see like, yeah, okay, this was mine.
Super interesting.
Yes, I would like to maybe have the visual going like all the time.
Okay.
No, sorry, not your visual. I mean, I wish that I could have
that in the background.
Turns just repeat. Yeah, I think I might just like freeze the frame so there's some design. Just like that. Okay, so the interaction portion is pretty straightforward. I have a LiDAR sensor that I don't have hooked up right now, but this is the LiDAR processing. I'm not going to jump into that, but I do have a lot of YouTube videos about how I use the LiDAR sensor. So anybody that wants to look at that more in depth can definitely look there. I also have my audio in, which was two different mics, one for each side of this interactive experience, and then the audio processing and sending my output signals. Again, no signal coming in because I don't have those mics hooked up, and the one mic I do have is going through the stream. But in theory, those are going off. And then I also have, just for performance, a noise texture that I use several places across the entire system. And I just centralized it here so that I would only have to cook all of that one time for performance. The other thing that I'll add is, for this experience in particular, I mentioned that as you are adding pigment, the color that you add changes depending on where you touch, which was a little bit trickier to implement than it seems like it should have been. So like over here, I'm kind of adding some yellow, and over here, it's more like purple. And this is all done through a custom blob tracking script that basically has a separate pass that stores where each blob initially started when it was created, and then uses that information in a vertex shader to then render geometry that has that encoded in the color of the geometry, which I can then read in a fragment shader pass that does the actual generative art rendering.
Wow. So
it was kind of a tricky thing to figure out how to get that information into GPU world so that I could just read it into the shader and know where each of those blobs started performantly. Because all of this had to run on the GPU because my CPU on that machine was like not hot. So that was a fun part to figure out. And probably like the biggest hill that I had to climb for this one, which was nice because I didn't really know that I could do that type of custom blob information passing. And I'll definitely be using it again in future installations. So for each of the user sessions, what I called them, one of these starts whenever somebody comes up and touches the screen to kind of like begin their turn. We have just some like classic chop processing of the interaction data. So this is going to say like, where somebody's touching. I have a very simple timer with some segments. Segments are great. If you guys don't use segments on the timer, I use them all the time now that I've found out about them. It just says, like, here's the session starts, the fade out, the freeze at the end. All of that is just like a separate little timeline element that I run through every time somebody starts. And there's one of these going for each side independently.
It's one timer with like 3 pieces in it, or 3 segments.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because timers sometimes can hit performance, especially if you have a lot of them going in the project at
Yes.
once. So anytime I can get more than one into a single timer, I always like to do so. And a lot of times
Nice.
it's like I want to have a timer that starts another timer that starts another timer.
Right.
And
Right.
segments are what that is made for. So
Nice.
very helpful. The other great thing is that you can hit an extension every time you exit or enter a segment on the callbacks for the timer.
That's awesome.
And so every time I enter and exit a segment, I hit this extension function on segment enter or exit, which then, does a bunch of complex or custom stuff, whatever, based on whether it's the intro session or the freezing or the fade out, which made that pretty easy to implement. Extensions are great. So, and then the last thing in this like user session infrastructure piece is using that segment timeline to just do some animation. So I have 3 different animations. Each of them just animates the parameters of the generative scene in different ways. And so this animation plays during segment 1. This one plays during segment 2. This one plays during segment 3. And when I set them up, just made sure that like the beginning and ends of each of them all clamp to the same values so that it's all seamless transitioning. And so in that way, there's kind of this story arc of the parameters that is repeated each time, but feels kind of dynamic.
Nice.
And all of that information is just passed into this generative component and mapped out to the different parameters. So this is getting into some of the more interesting stuff. Although,
Function store for the win.
yes, you said shout out Dan earlier, but besides being a good friend, he is just a killer with all of the quality
He's
of
the
life
best.
improvements.
Oh my god.
I like
You can't live without
the
him.
days before I found it. Yeah, like
Yeah.
what was I doing?
You
I was
open
just
up a project and it
right-clicking
doesn't
to
have
open
that
this every
bar.
time.
And you're like,
Oh
fuck.
man, yeah, it's great. I like spec it into some installations because I'm just like,
Nice.
this is stupid. Okay, so in here, I had all of these clients' colors for branding. So I had a generative patch that took all of their kind of like corporate branding assets and generated some custom palettes that I ended up using and
Nice.
pulling like, a different palette each user session. So this is the piece that I was talking about, the generative GLSL shader pass that takes in all of the information about the user touches and uses that information to generate this color field. So you can kind of see, I don't know, how's that coming through?
Yeah, coming through.
Cool. So it's this, if I actually can probably crank up the resolution so you can see this specific thing a little bit better.
So this is almost your brush, basically. Your paintbrush.
This is both the brush and like the base canvas that I use in different ways. But I just do it all in one pass and then use masks so that I can just do this calculation one time because this
Gotcha.
is
Smart.
probably the heaviest calculation in the whole thing. It's like half a millisecond right now, but it's running at 640 by 180.
Right.
And I really like the detail and form that this gives. It's all based on procedural terrain.
Cool.
So I use it as kind of like my stock noise for a lot of stuff because, it is just noise at the end of the day, but my parameters have different things that I spend a ton of time developing.
This is a shader. This is GLSL.
Yeah, this is all one big shader that I adapted for this specific client project because the contract I signed for this one was me renting them the work and not work for hire. So I felt comfortable using my own like proprietary stuff.
Smart.
But anyway, yeah, so this is that. And I think maybe if I do this over here, will this work? I should do it this way. Sorry, I need to be able to fake the interaction for this to be able to see. So now I'm faking the interaction off screen. You can see the circle that's appearing on screen.
Mask.
That's changing the color. And so that color is being changed in real time, just like in the shader, using the information that I'm passing to it from the blob tracking pipeline that I wrote. And so that was essential because otherwise I would have had to do like 4 of these passes.
Right, for each
one
color
for each
palette.
for each color palette. And that would have, it just wouldn't have worked. So that was
Just out of interest, when you switch between each color palette, is it just feeding into the GLSL like a new base image or something, or is it like, it's feeding in just like a new gradient?
I just have these ramps. I have these ramps that these are just files. So these are just like looking at files in a folder. I have 30 of them that I went through and created as like a pre-pass, basically. They have anywhere from 5 to 12 different colors, all from the asset guidelines. And I was basically just like spent 4 hours generating palettes and dumping them into this system and just being like, okay, which do I like?
Looks nice. Right.
Which looks good? Which has too much purple? Which has not enough orange?
Right.
And then from there, I took those palettes, remixed them all, and like randomly mixed the pixels from all of those palettes into new palettes. And then repeated that process once more. And so that's what I'm pulling from here.
Interesting. And then is it just like is it just an array inside of the GLSL that you're switching between, or is it literally just like an input switch?
No, it's just all of these 4 inputs go in. Those inputs are wired to this folder system. Yeah. And so that folder just gets updated based on every time there's like a new person that comes. Those all get updated, and there's feedback elsewhere in the system, so you don't like see any of this happening. It's sharp right here, but it's obviously not
right
in the final thing. But because it's only one shader, there's no switching, and there's no like multiple passes or arrays of anything to be done in the actual computation, which was also important for performance on this one.
Interesting.
I was basically outputting dual 8K, which was from one machine, so it was like max.
Serious.
Yeah. So this was that piece, and all these parameters would also like change every time. So like
just randomize them in some way.
Yeah, the noise field. I had different presets that I had compiled in the past, and I think just interpolate between each of the presets every time the colors change. So you have a little bit of a different noise field and different colors. If one person goes through this experience, they will never, in theory, be able to see the same thing. Definitely not twice in a row, but probably not twice.
I mean, not only in theory, I think in practice, probably, if you run the numbers, probably.
Especially if they touch it, too.
Millions of numbers. Yeah, especially if they move around.
Yeah, well, no, because I changed the seeds and everything like multiple times each iteration. So, it's mathematically highly unlikely. And then this is the actual generative effect itself, which I can jump into. Less clean when we get this deep, but it's okay.
Like nobody's going to see this.
Simulation. Yeah, right. And then here I am. So for this one, I don't know. A lot of the viewers don't work for this because it's heavily optimized at this point. But I basically have a fluid simulation that's doing nothing but outputting a advected velocity field. And so I'm just doing basically that purely for the advection, and I'm feeding it a noise field to just give it some dynamics. That is the noise field that I have that I showed at the very beginning, because I use it to feed this fluid system, and then I use it for a couple other like overlay layers, which I think kind of just integrate a lot of the different layers in a nice way. Anyway, that is the fluid system, and then the only other part of this entire visual is actually just this this GLSL script, which is basically a displaced top that has a lot of, well, not even more parameters necessarily. I just wanted to be able to vary a lot of the parameters of the displaced top over the canvas in a way that you can't just using tops. So I basically just rewrote it, made it a multiple pass shader, and
when you say rewrote it, did you how where did you get the base GLSL of the displace top, or did you just write a whole new displacement kind of thing?
Yeah, I just wrote a new displacement.
Okay.
Using the docs from Derivative and just like the way that they
Set it
in
up.
human language described how the function worked.
Gotcha.
But in doing that, I had an actual displace top that I would just like diff
AB.
the actual pixels and be like, is this pixel the same as this pixel?
That's so cool.
It
I
worked.
love that.
And then the main reason I wanted to bring this up is because it basically allowed me to do nearest pixel, but not everywhere. And that's what I was after. And that is what gives kind of the cool, like,
Pixel
rock
kind of
formation, like stretching movement. Because it's displaced, but it's not interpolated across most of the screen. And so those colors then propagate themselves, because if you interpolate in part of the feedback loop, but not in the actual computation, it's just kind of an artifact that appears. And I really liked that when I found it. And so I basically built this entire aesthetic around me making that mistake and being like, whoa, I wish I could
I
do
love
this
that.
with a little bit more control. And then I spent, a while building the control and figuring out all the different things that I wanted to be able to tune. And I really liked this rock layers, geologic stratum type of thing, which is why I ended up using it for this work, for this commission when it came around, because the conceptual basis, like, the prompt, if you will, from the client was a crossroads in human history, seismic changes across technology and culture. And so I thought that this really, to me, evoked seismic change in a very cool, interactive way. And so then it was a matter of selling the client, kind of conveying that vision to them. And, talked about that already. But that's why I ended up using this. And I think that is... And then I just have a nice little LUT at the end, because they do a lot of good work. And that's pretty much it. And then sorry?
No, please continue. I just wanted to know that what gives off that like almost like particle looking effect, where it's like when you click, there's almost like particles or some sort of.
So that's part of it is the displacement with the nearest pixel like adjustment that I made, and that's kind of why they look like they shoot. But then when I'm adding the pigment into the shader kind of feedback loop, I have some displacement on that as well. That is very pixelated.
Specifically so it's like a super high, like a super high period noise or something like that.
Well, but it's almost. I wanted it to be that, but because of resolution constraints, I couldn't. And so I settled for a 640 by 180 texture that I was displacing at, and then upscaling to the full 8K. So it had those like very sharp corners because the pixels were there, but then it was upscaled, so it was still like nice and crisp. And that's what led to that.
What a crazy result from that, because it looks like
it
looks like almost like a some sort of particle sim that you're just running when you touch or something that's like pushing out.
Which is what I was after. But I managed, like, this was also a happy accident that came along.
Totally.
I was like, whoa, this is better than me, like, programming a whole emitter system and, like, on top of it. So,
because it's like, it works really well because it kind of blends in with, like, it's not just a particle simulation. It's like a particle thing that's inside of the actual field.
Yes.
So it, like, kind of melts into everything. Very, very effective.
Thank you. I am glad you like it. It's one of those, that's a quality that I try to strive for a lot. And I feel like I hit not 100% of the time, but like as much as I can.
It's just like one of these things that like, it's, the first thing that I'm thinking is like, okay, a client comes like, oh, I saw this fluid simulation online where people can touch and it makes like a fluid sim, like the classic, I think you even have it on your GitHub.
I do.
Like the classic fluid. I remember when it was like viral, the WebGL fluid thing of like, oh look, everybody could do the fluid simulation now, and it's like, okay, super cool, but this is just like the very first kind of like simple thing of it, and then you're like, like a client saying, "Oh, I want that," and then like somebody's like, "Yeah, I could do that, sure," and just like throwing the WebGL kind of thing into it, and then like
Yeah.
my imagination of like the difference between like people interacting with like this very base level thing, and like maybe you get like 10, 15 people to do it, but then eventually it's gonna be like, okay, well, yeah, I get it, it's like a gimmick, versus like this implementation, which is like a full on artistic expression that's going to not only draw more people in, but create like a much deeper resonance with the people, and obviously a much more beautiful final result. And it's just interesting to see these kind of like the dichotomy between these two things of like, yeah, they're both just like interactive fluid simulations, but one is like super intricate and has like a lot of thought behind it, and one is kind of like just like this base level preset made thing. So I think it's super cool to see into the machination of that, and hopefully people can see the difference. I know people can see the difference. I have this argument a lot with, not argument, but I have this discussion a lot with VJs of like, does the audience know the difference between real time and loops? And like, even if they don't know the difference, if you look at a screen and you're on mind-altering substances, even if the loop is as seamless as can be, if I see it 5 or 6 times, I'm gonna notice that cube or whatever the fuck is the thing is moving in the same way, versus if I see like some generative noise kind of thing happening, and like obviously you could take that argument to infinitum. Okay, what if I make a loop that's 50 minutes long, et cetera, et cetera? Okay, but then if you have a 50-minute loop, that's kind of generative, I would say. So it's like,
yeah. Exactly. I remember, like, I don't know, 8 years ago or something like that, I was at a performance, and it was, I think, like literally such an easy filter looking back, but it was basically just like real-time camera feed with like an inversion and then like a chroma key and like a glitch. There you go. And I was like, whoa, I could see this performer in real time, but with like these filters on it in post, my mind was just blown. And I like to think that I'm making this stuff for the people that can tell the difference and that care enough. Like,
I love that.
If you can't, that's all right.
You're going to enjoy it anyways. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. I think it's important. I think we forget sometimes as how the sausage, I had this, the same experience in film school. I went to film school, and like, there's this moment where there's like a bell curve. When you're at the top of the bell curve, you're like, oh, every movie you watch, you're like, oh, I know how they did that. Oh, I know how they did that. Oh, they could have done like this. Oh, I know how they did that. And then you like kind of lose your excitement for the movie. And then you kind of start going down the bell curve of like, oh, I'm just like, I know how hard it is to do this thing. I've done it a few times. It's so difficult that now you're like appreciating something on a kind of a different place, So I feel like it's similar when you go to visual shows. You're like, oh, I know how they did that. Oh, it's easy. Oh, it's thing. And then when you're like watching something at a high level, you're like, okay, I know how he did it, but it's so fucking cool, Like,
it doesn't. I know how hard that is.
I know how hard that is, exactly. I know how hard that is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's a kind of, I think it's very important to not forget that. Not necessarily as like a way of like, oh, you have to make something super cool or super intricate because there might be somebody, with industry knowledge, but like, just as like you said, like the person who's going to appreciate it that doesn't know anything is going to appreciate anything. But the person who's going to appreciate it that knows so much, you want to make them appreciate it as well.
Yeah, definitely. Because I feel like that's the art that I want to go see and that I hope is there. When I go to a show, that's what I'm like, okay, I hope the VJ's the real one.
Totally.
And when it is, it's great. And I'm just thrilled to see it. So, yeah, it's great to be able to just like hear like-minded thoughts on that as well.
For sure. Awesome. What else you got for us?
So I think to finish off this project, the last thing that I wanted to mention was the printout portion.
Oh, yes. Yes, super fascinating.
Okay, so man, again, with nobody's supposed to see this far down. All right. So basically, I have a engine, and I'm using the engine comp to both save the image and then also print the image. I actually have the engine comp here though. And so this is what's inside that. And basically it just, uses this. And then I have a chop execute that hits a extension, or actually this just does the save with the chop execute, because in engines, sometimes I've had weird behavior with extension. So I just use the chop execute. And then I have a command line utility that gets called as part of a subprocess through this Python extension that ends up printing out to my printer, addressable printer, using a command line argument via the Python subprocess module. And that then does the printing in a really nice asynchronous manner. So then you have your save in the engine, no frame drops, and then you print via the command line in a separate process. And that is also just really smooth. That was important because there could be somebody finishing while somebody on the other side is like mid-experience, and you don't want, frame drops when you're saving one side to affect the other. So that was my solve there. I also have a video that goes into more depth on like all of the command line code and some process stuff online. So if you're interested in that,
Wow,
you can get more there.
that's awesome. I love Touch Engine. Did you wanted to use a Touch Engine to separate the cores so that there wasn't like any performance things? Is that kind of the
Yeah,
gist
because
of
I
using
was
Touch Engine?
CPU constrained on this machine,
Right.
because there was some other stuff going on, and so I wanted to use the engine comp in this case just so that I could get that save done on a different thread.
On a different thread, right? So you didn't have a hiccup. That's smart.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of like the best, maybe not the only use case of Touch Engine, but definitely one of the better use cases of the engine is kind of like you can keep, you don't have to have two projects running simultaneously to talk to each other. You can have it all in one project, but simultaneously you can have multiple, kind of multi-threading, but not really. I guess single threading, but with multiple, using separate threads on the same project, which is very useful.
Yeah, and like I've done this in the past using separate instances and sending data in between and doing like sending chop to hit a data executor, just like some weird stuff. This is better. This is definitely better.
Yeah,
Especially now with a lot of the updates. Sorry about that. Some of the updates to the engine comp and the touch engine, like separate functionality that I've just started to get into. So yeah,
it's super
that's all very good.
powerful. There's definitely moments where you're going to want to send OSC to a project or touch in and out. But I think when you're like wanting sometimes you got to, but when you're just wanting to like for instance, in this case, save a file, but you don't want it to, hinder your performance. It's such an easy implementation of something. And it's like, it's in your project.
Yeah.
Like instead of making a whole other project to save a file, which would be like annoying.
Yeah.
Well,
because you also gotta like send the naming information and make sure that you're like, this is great. So yeah, I think that was pretty much everything about this project. I don't know. So this is something that I've been working on more recently. I'll get into it all, but basically this is a Gaussian splatting system that is turned into a particle system that is then passed into a painting algorithm, basicly. And so this is generating composition. Well, we're going to get into it all, so I can't give away all the details,
Okay.
But yeah, let's just get into things. So basically, this whole thing came about, one, because Gaussian splatting is awesome, and I really wanted to get into learning how to use this in Touch Designer. Tim Gerritsen gave the community his great component that actually implemented everything performantly, which is great because it was out of my reach. Probably it would have taken me a very, very long time to figure out.
Lake has a really awesome Gaussian splatting tutorial for anybody who's interested.
Yes,
I've watched it. It's great.
I'm glad to hear that. So that's like a lot of the stuff is touched on in there. But I started this because I wanted to use those, and I've been trying to figure out a way to bring in field recordings to my work because it's not audio based. I don't really want to use photos. Videos are kind of like, I don't know, done. And so when I found this Gaussian splatting and a lot of the new tools to make it really easy, I was excited. So anyway, a lot of the assets that I'm using are stuff that I've recorded over my travels the last couple of years. This one that we're looking at came from a residency I did in Portugal earlier this year.
Nice. My
I
favorite
think
place.
maybe on the screen, yeah, I mean, it is the best. This is like a wild thistle bush that I did a spot scan of. One of the things I actually really like is that you can either have it be very high fidelity if you really, really try, or you can just kind of roll with the artifacts that introduce some of the imperfections. And for this series of work, I was going for more of a impressionist, painterly dynamic. So I decided to lean into some of the more like not super high quality scans. I explicitly filmed all of these on very windy days. And so, you know, anybody that's tried to film scans on windy days just like never, ever, ever works. And I decided to try and lean into that because it added some sort of abstract, ethereal nature while still being very clearly what it is. And I like that as a starting place. So anyway, this is the Gaussian splatting component with my modifications to it, which is this GLSL feedback loop that takes in our point file and treats each of these as a particle and allows whatever forces you want, basically in like particle GPU style, to be added to the component. So here we have like, is this all? Sorry, I'm going to stop the animation. Nope, that didn't do it. Stop the animation. Okay. So you can, just like add a bunch of effects to the particle system. So like if you want to add your turbulence to the location of the particles and move them, you can. If you want to send the particles back to their home space, you can do that too. I really liked being able to mix different parts of the particle system from point cloud to Gaussian splats. And so I had another element that would basically turn it all into a point cloud.
Pretty.
And then use turbulence to mix kind of between the point cloud and the Gaussian splatting system. And so that adds a nice dynamic, kind of just having both of those going at low levels throughout the installation. This I can't show at the moment because I don't have any of the sensors hooked up. But the interactive portion of this is as the users interact with the scene, they're basically displacing the actual particles. So they're brushing, brushing the leaves away, brushing the grass away, exploring the scene and moving through it.
That's sick.
But it takes a like 3D LiDAR, and I don't have one of those on me, so can't do that. But we have that splat render, which is, like I said, just
so that's
that particle
like
system.
That's like a custom version of the implementation by Tim.
Yeah, I took Tim's basic thing and then added, basically made a lot of changes. A lot more detail on a lot of that is available through the Node Institute. I did a 3-hour workshop on basically this shader right here. And so that's available. Unfortunately, it's not freely available, but it is available. And maybe worth paying for, depending how interested you guys all are.
Definitely.
But it's way too much to get into right now. There's a lot of just low level stuff that needed to be taken care of to make it work the way that I wanted it to. But I will also be doing actually another 2-part workshop. First on just general particle systems using compute shaders, and then also a second part on this Gaussian splatting particle system specifically in December this year with the Node Institute.
Cool. Awesome. Shout out Node Institute. Awesome.
Yeah, the 18th and whatever the week is after, the 11th and the 18th. That's what it is.
Okay.
So that's coming up. But anyway, moving on. I'm taking this and also a velocity map that I'm outputting when these move. So basically just like running optical flow over the particle system that's moving as a displacement map, which will, if I give some actual movement, you can kind of see this as the displacement map that's getting created. You can see some of the splats appearing here. And I then mix it with the noise that I, like the displacement that's going on and the noise that's driving the actual displacement in the particle system. I project to a 2D plane, and that's what is going on in this space. I'm just using that projected noise as another layer in the displacement to, again, just kind of like integrate the 3-dimensional world and the 2-dimensional world. I think a lot of composition in this space, at least the way that I think about it, comes down to mixing that 3-dimensional representation with the screen space representation in ways that are compelling. So that's one way that I'm doing that here. I'm also just taking in the raw interaction data elsewhere. So it's being used in the splat system, but then also in the paint system, which I'll jump into. And then lastly, this chroma key layer, which is pretty self-explanatory. I just chroma key 3 or 4 different layers, and I use those as pigment addition in my painting system. Which
what do you
I'm
mean
not sure
by that?
how. Yeah, this isn't. It's only so much that I can show, and it's all just in the shader. But basically, this is a pixel sorting algorithm that is adapted so that it never loses pigment. I think one of the things that I was really struggling with for a long time was how to kind of have generative systems that accumulate, but in ways that are meaningful and not just like ends up being very muddy.
Mush.
Or, yeah, you either get the mush or you get like, I touch and it disappears. Right. And so it's very important for me from the interaction design perspective to be able to have that legibility of interaction, but also the legibility of history, because that gives temporality to the user's experience in, I think, a very intuitive way. And so anyway, long story short, I designed this pixel sorting algorithm because I wanted to have that sort of push pixel movement, but in a way that retained all of the pigment and allowed you to kind of have a, like I said, history of your own interaction with the environment. And so that is what the shader is doing. But then it's also important to have it constantly moving, right? Because if it's not moving, somebody's like, oh, the installation's broken. Or, oh, you're dropping frames. Or like,
right.
So it's important to have signs of life if that's what you want, and it was in this case. So that was where I come with this chroma key layer to basically just, I use a very thin slice, like a low opacity pass of this texture, and just add that pigment each frame to, in the end result, which maybe you just cut to the stream of the end result.
Yeah, I have it. I'm going back and forth.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, so like in this end result, you have the kind of swaying of the elements, both from the turbulence itself, from the viewers when the viewers are moving it, but also you could have an accumulation of your own interactions. And so you kind of have both of those elements constantly evolving, and you can see that, but you don't lose what you do into the mush. And I think that is something that I feel like I've been trying to incorporate more and more into the installations that I'm doing now. Just making sure that the interaction design is very tight and putting equally, if not more attention into the interaction design itself as the aesthetics. So I think when you're there in doing it, seeing it, experiencing it yourself, human perception is very, very good. And it's easy to tell yourself, nobody will notice. It's like half a frame behind. But like, they're probably going to notice. And so
or it might just be subconscious, like we spoke about before. You know, they might just be like, oh, I don't want to interact with it because it's not as,
Exactly.
punchy as it
And
was.
the reason I like to use a lot of these organic elements like fluid systems, whatever, is because I think they are very familiar on a subconscious level. Like, how many fluid dynamic systems have you seen in your
Totally.
life? Can't count them, right?
Totally.
And I think that's very meaningful. I think it does it creates physical changes in your, neurochemical makeup at
100%.
any given point. That familiarity is real. And anyway, it's a blessing and a curse because it's familiar, but at the same time, it means when it doesn't look the way that you think it should. And you can use that sometimes as a stylistic thing, but often you want it to look like pretty real. And that means that when you interact with it, it needs to look like you're interacting with the fluid system. And that needs to be pretty snappy. So anyway, a bit long-winded, but I've been spending a lot more time focusing on that side of the practice. And I think it's very important to me to continue just kind of like that trajectory as I'm doing new projects and things.
Super cool. I have two questions. One is you mentioned it before that you have one of on the bottom. It's taking the sim and kind of chroma keying it into three different passes. So and then that's being used as the paintbrush. And I kind of asked to explain that a little bit. So what is actually happening there?
Oh, what's going on in here? Oh, it's nothing special.
No, I mean, like, what is actually happening when you're saying that I'm chroma keying it and then using that as a paintbrush? Like, is it just separating it into its different channels, or?
Yeah, so I'm literally just have 3 chroma key tops, and I'm just grabbing out the different channels based on whatever this specific image system has the colors of, right? Just like the 3 colors. In this case, the ones that to me visually felt right. And so then I have this separate texture, which is only the keyed out layers put back onto a single texture. And then and
that's your paintbrush essentially. That I'm like when I interact with it.
Yes, so this is a paintbrush that's kind of always occurring regardless of the interaction, but it's at a very low opacity. So this texture is being multiplied by like a 0.005 constant or something like that.
Okay.
In the paintbrush shader. And so it's adding to the pigment, but very subtly, and then the interactions that occur from a user interaction perspective add motion, and then perform additional mixing on the pigments.
So cool. Such an interesting way to because you're basically using that to create some sort of, we were talking about before, this very subtle movement that kind of makes it feel alive without, getting into muddiness or whatever, which would basically happen if you just used like a very basic feedback at some point. It would just kind of get all whatever. So you're using this kind of like chroma keyed or whatever selected part of the base thing to kind of get there. I love that. That's such a simple yet effective use of that.
I'm glad it worked out well. I think I will be using this technique going forward in different ways. Really
cool. I love this. The result. I mean, it's just so beautiful, super beautiful.
Thank you. It is one of my favorites recently. Each one looks very different too. I only have one like ready to show at the moment, but I'm working on a series of probably 10 of these guys. With some various different ways of interacting.
Can you move the camera around? Can you move the 3D camera around?
I can. This is literally, I was working on making this better earlier this morning. So right now I can move the camera, and it's kind of cool.
Super cool.
But I haven't.
Kind of cool.
Well, I haven't figured out how it like works, right? So I can do it when I'm clicking and dragging, and I like the way that it looks. But
it is a little bit
out how to fully,
it is a bit like you're not really sure what it is that you're doing. But I must say, when you do turn it, there is a moment before you stop turning. And
that's what I like.
Before you stop turning, that I'm kind of getting. I'm kind of understanding the space again. Maybe it's almost like when you're turning, all the parameters like shift down. And then when you stop turning, then they come back to where they were, or something along those lines. So that like when you're turning, you're kind of like back in 3D space. That's like maybe more like understanding, but it's super.
Yes.
But then again, like I must say, at the same time, there is something cool about the 3D turbulence of everything. You know what I mean? Like it's almost like when I'm moving around, I kind of want to see the turbulence and like what's going on. So maybe you just remove like the like the 2D aspect of it. I don't know. It's super cool.
Yeah.
Like
there's definitely a right balance. I haven't found it yet. But yes, that is number 1 on my list of things to keep exploring here. Because I think there's definitely something there that is yet untapped.
Yeah, like switching between the view that one more time. Switching between what you're showing now in the camera viewport versus like the final output. Like in the camera viewport, I'm kind of getting it without the 2D
so
smush on it.
Sorry, I forgot to mention this in the installation. So there's 2 interactive elements. One is the pushing away, like I mentioned, and the other is these Z cameras that are basically just doing like silhouette tracking. And so that gives an interaction zone. This was installed or is being created for an installation that I'm working on coming up. That's going to be like a very large scale LED screen, basically up at the front. And so that's going to have the zone of interaction that's going to be kind of quasi touch. And then there's going to be a further back zone of interaction. And that's going to be the set cameras. And anyway,
some depth
playing. That interaction element is going to be transitioning, kind of slicing between the 3D and the 2D. So that's going to be how those 2 elements are brought in. Because I agree, having the dichotomy between kind of however you describe this, and the 2D post process is quite compelling.
Yeah, super compelling. Just like switching between them here, like between this like very painterly kind of thing, and then the camera's view of this very like almost psychedelic kind of acidy kind of vibe of like things mushing. I think is very cool. Exactly. Very, very nice. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing all this with us. I love seeing works in progress. I would say that this is more of a final thing than a work in progress, but
it's all a work in progress,
we're always a work in progress. Wow. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to share with us before we switch gears?
No, I think that is good for now.
Okay, cool. So you touched on fluid sims, and this is actually my first question in our second portion. I totally agree with you. I think fluid simulations, it's my favorite simulations for sure. I'm not so much of a 2D person, so my fluid simulations are usually in the 3D space. I'm a very heavy Unreal person, and there's a great there's been fluid simulations in there for a while, but most recently, I think maybe 2 years ago, they brought in really awesome fluid sims into Niagara that are very, very, very hard to use, but once you kind of get the 5 little things that you need to know, are very fun to use. And I also think that they're really powerful in terms of like the way people interact with it. What is a simulation to you, and kind of, math in general and art to me, and this is something that I really comes up almost every episode, whether it's a generative artist or not, there's this aspect of, this is a very long-winded question, but there's an aspect of, and we can call it spirituality, you can call it the beauty of nature, the intricacy of math, whatever you want to call it. I don't think it really matters. I think it's all the same. But the idea that, simulation is basically taking reality and putting it into numbers and letting us interact with reality in a different or more, computational way that then brings it down to our 3D dimension and lets us play with it. And I think it's really cool to think about, like, noise patterns are essentially mathematical equations of like wind patterns, or, mold patterns, or, Brownian noise of like particles flowing in the air. And I think it's so cool that we as artists get to take reality, or whatever, the number representation of reality, and then use that as our quote unquote paintbrush, which is kind of, if you think about it, the same thing that people have been doing for thousands of years with cave paintings, with, painting, with I look and see something and I bring it to the 2D world and paint it or draw it.
Impressionism.
Impressionism, exactly. So, how does that touch you? Where does it fit in your life and your ethos? And what is a simulation to Lake?
I think that I agree with a lot of what you said. To me, it started. I came at all of this from a very mathematical background, and the type of math that I studied was very theoretical. So it was like not so much, doing coding, but a lot of writing proofs and like logical exercises, stuff like that. And to me, I really liked that theory, but it was always kind of like this. Okay, but like, what does that really do, right? Like, what does this do for me? And so I guess the answer to what is a simulation, or like, what does it mean to me? It's the thing that transitions theory into practice.
Ooh, wow.
For me. And that means that I get to take concept, develop a nice theoretical basis for this concept, reaction diffusion systems, fluid simulation, erosion, flocking, like, magnetic fields in the sun. Just, whatever it is.
You're turning me on right now, Blake.
Yeah, it's sick. It's so cool. And that's one of the things that I love about this. It makes me excited to research all of this in like a very scientific, mathematical way. Read papers, understand to the degree that I can, in some cases, like the differential equations, all the stuff that's really going on. I can't understand it all. I can understand a lot of it. And the stuff that I can't, get as close as I can. And then once I have all of that, the simulation aspect is kind of like one half me testing my understanding and the other half me being able to use this now in a conceptual way, that thing that I've been very interested in. Like I said before, the thing that I like about these simulations also is that they give very familiar but still abstract imagery and form. And I think there's something very powerful in seeing something that feels almost like deja vu. You're like, okay, this feels like something I've seen before, but I can't tell you why or where it's ever been seen before, but it feels right. It feels intuitive to me. One of my favorite artists said that the illusion of inevitability is the essence of art. And I think about that a lot because, everybody watching this for sure has seen some piece of art that is just like impossible to imagine any other way. And when you're creating, you go through all these iterations on every single project. But ideally, you get to an end that's such a cohesive whole that it can't be anything besides that. And anyway, I think that is, for me, kind of what using these simulations as elements of form helps to do. Because when you see things that are familiar and feel like a dream, like deja vu, or like, I've seen this so many places, but I can't tell you where or why, leads to that illusion of inevitability in a way that I personally, at least, feel and want to explore. So that's kind of my long-winded answer to the question.
No, that's a beautiful answer. And you're having such great quotes on this episode. I wish I had some sort of chat bot that could go through the whole episode and get these quotes and remind me of them. Maybe I should talk to Lyle about that. We get a visual cast chat bot.
Barnett Newman, the abstract expressionist painter, that said that. Huge fan. I read a lot, so I got lots of quotes.
Yeah, totally. I love it. I read a lot too, but I have no quotes. This is the difference in brains.
Yeah,
it just gets fed into my psyche. I don't know. I don't know what it is.
More important, probably.
Totally is. I have a very bad memory. It's all the marijuana that I smoked over the years. Yeah. Cool. I love this kind of like, and obviously we can probably go on forever about generative art and kind of what it means. And, I'm not a very I'm not a very scientific person, even though I wish I was. And I had like I mean, I'm not old enough to have a midlife crisis yet, but I had a mid-artist crisis maybe like two or 3 years ago, when I was shifting from being much more of a creative to being much more of a technical person and a tech artist, because of virtual production and the work that I do. And I kind of almost said to myself, I want to go back to school and study a science to get like a higher level. And then my wife's like, there's no way that that's going to happen. You're a terrible student and you're never going to manage to do it. And I'm like, fuck, you're right. But like, part of me is like, I wish at least at that point, part of me was really intrigued by wanting to learn and understand these things that I use all the time at a deeper level. And then I kind of realized that I already do, just not on like a mathematical way. You know what I mean? Like in a intuitively, or through practice, through actual like observation, right? Like, and then so many high level scientists make the point of saying like observation, and I don't know the quote of it obviously, but there's many quotes of it, but observation is just as powerful as like actually understanding the formula, right? Like looking at or watching a Brownian noise, or watching the field and the wind patterns, is almost the same power as understanding the mathematical function of it. So I kind of like jumped onto that train of like, and then try to feed myself with as much of experience as I can when it comes to these things, and watch a lot of scientific research, videos, and get my my YouTube academic flowing. And I feel like it
but
just
if watching
enriches.
clouds also never hurt anybody.
I love watching clouds for sure, if I can find the time. If my baby isn't bothering, but I guess watching my son grow is another kind of aspect of this, kind of like seeing
I think so,
this
probably.
Consciousness evolve, really powerful as well. So yeah, I just feel like there's in a way I'm jealous of people like yourself that have this mathematical understanding, but I'm also like kind of come around and maybe less jealous and more like appreciative of your level of understanding. So yeah, and what I really, my real point of this is that I love hearing people like yourselves' explanation of it, because it's not much more, but it's rich in a way that that my words sometimes fail to express, and it inspires me to dig deeper and to understand it more. So your long-winded answer was very much wanted and merited. So thank you. You mentioned before that you grew up adjacent to religious communities. If I may ask, what kind of religious denomination, and what is your take on that kind of aspect of it? I know it's a very can of worms. I'm happy to share my experience as well, if it makes you any more comfortable.
Yeah, it was, Lancaster, Pennsylvania is Amish capital of probably the country. Definitely the eastern side of the country. And so there's a lot of Amish people, but because of that, and related to it, I guess, there was also a lot of other very Orthodox Protestant Christian communities around, like Methodist, Mennonite. Just a lot of those communities had been in the county that I grew up in for, long time, since the
founding.
Basically, since the founding or before. I know there's those like old houses that we went around to in elementary school. It was like, this dude built this house in 1612 when he walked from like,
oh my God.
Whatever. The house that I grew up in is over 200 years old now.
Wow, that's crazy.
So there's a lot of history. But anyway, that was, definitely like the pervading cultural atmosphere was very Protestant Christian, and a very rural version of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that as I grew, I ended up having more desire to have experiences that were different from what I had already experienced, to be able to just like understand the place that I grew up in a little bit better, I think. And as I had more of those experiences, my view broadened a little bit, and I think over time became less and less tied to where I grew up, both from the religious perspective, but also just like, from the geographic perspective. And these days, not really a huge part of life, like in any way. But I think as far as growing up with it, I'm glad that I did. I think that it's a good moral background to have. Like, you can't say that I disagree with many of the
Core
super
values.
basic tenets, like just be a good neighbor, don't fucking kill people, like don't steal. Those are all pretty good things.
Well, if you're
and
stealing
so-
from like a big supermarket chain, I think it's okay.
That's very fair. Don't steal from people who you shouldn't steal from. I'm down with Robin Hood, definitely.
I
take
always
from
have
their-
this like, my religious upbringing. Whenever you're in the self checkout counter and like I'm like, is anybody watching? I'm gonna skip this really expensive piece of meat. The back of my head, like the front of my head is like, oh fuck Amazon, like I don't care about them, and the back of my head is like, oh, but God is gonna be upset at me. Like some like version of that is in my head somewhere. It's so funny.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, steal sometimes, but definitely don't kill people. That's bad.
Definitely
So,
don't
I
kill
think-
people.
Having all of that growing up was very good. I think that is something, besides the very tight-knit community, that's, I don't know, I wouldn't say difficult to replicate, but that religious communities do well, let's say. Because that also was like a pretty tight community. You had like your school groups, like Sunday school groups, after church groups, like whole thing. And I do think there's a lot of value in having that type of community.
Totally.
Just got to find the one that is right for you.
There's a super fine line. I think maybe it's different in, I grew up in a Orthodox Jewish settlement in Israel, not like the curly hair Orthodox, but still Orthodox, modern Orthodox they're called. But the community aspect of it is the most familiar and most like connecting aspect that I remember of it. But there's that fine line of like, when does the community become like chatty, oh, this guy's doing this thing and don't do that. And, I don't want to get divorced from my really toxic relationship because people will say something, or my son's, sexual orientation is not, going to fit in with the thing. So there's always like this kind of like fine line. But I think you're right. I think that that's really the best positive things out of, small rural religious communities are that the community aspect that I know me and my wife are striving to find wherever we move, to find that kind of feeling of community, especially when you have kids and when you move out of the city, you want that. It's so important. You don't even realize it until you don't have it. And then you're like, oh yeah, I love my neighbors. They're really nice to me, but I want something a little bit more than just like neighborly friendliness. And we were very lucky when we lived in Israel. We lived in a town in the north that was kind of like this like very like-minded, obviously, I'm a little bit more of a hippie, but like-minded kind of hippie community that really kind of showed me like, okay, it's possible to have this community aspect without a very strong religious kind of like ethos behind it. There's gonna be like opinions and ideology, and that's part of the community, right? You want that in a way. You want that. It's people. It's totally people. But ever since we moved to the States, it's kind of been very hard to find that and replicate it. And I feel like it's something that is very important. I feel like in the city you can kind of much more easily build it for yourself because there's just so many types of people. And you have your art community, you have your friend circle, and it's kind of like a little bit more built into the city. But yeah, I don't know if you had this experience, but my whole teenagehood was kind of rebelling, right? Was kind of like, yo, you said I shouldn't do that. Well, I'm going to do it, F you. And, this feels good. So why is it wrong? And it took me probably till my mid-20s and beyond to separate the idea of belief and religion, because for a very long time for me, and when I say belief, it's it's not like the word of like belief in God per se, or even belief in a higher power. I think it's just like nature's beautiful and evolution's beautiful, and it's more than just some sort of strict kind of rule set. It's something that we don't understand, or maybe quantum or different
That
dimensional.
I think is kind of the key. Or what I've come to believe is that all of these things are just words for things that we don't fully understand. And whether that's religion or science or math, art, like whatever it is, they're all just pointers to this very big black void of unknown. And it's very scary. And so everybody's got to find the explanation for the unknown that lets you sleep at night. And for me, like science and math is what stuck. I like it, but that perspective has given me, I think, more empathy towards people who maybe have a different answer to that question than I do. But I definitely went through a phase where I was more like, my answer is the right answer.
Right.
In a way, that's just as bad as a religious Orthodox community.
100%.
And it took me a bit to realize that. But once I did, I think, it was more...
It's freeing.
And just kind of gave me a much more open mindset towards everything, which I think is, I don't know, at least what I strive to have. The thing that I've definitely learned is that I'm not sure of anything, and acting like I am is probably the only thing I shouldn't do. So try and bring that these days.
Yeah, I think it's a smart way to live. It's I think that it's natural for people like us to kind of like build this wall. I mean, I don't know how it was for you, but for me, I realized that like I'm building this wall because I'm scared to be sucked back into the religion. Like once I realized, okay, my eyes open, I don't want to be part of this anymore. Now I have to make really strong walls between me and this thing so that I don't get sucked back into it. And then I realized that these walls are unnecessary, and like I can even take something from that religion and implement it in my life because it makes me feel good, or because it's my heritage, it's my ancestry. Like, why should I put my back towards it? I can be part of it without being influenced by it in a way that's indoctrination. That's a better word. I can appreciate it and love it without being indoctrinated by it, which I think is, it's hard for people that were indoctrinated very heavily to kind of understand, because it's like,
the period of distancing is important, but at some point it becomes more energy to maintain the walls than to let them fall, or maybe to build some windows or like a gate,
windows,
or
glass
something
house,
like that.
a gate,
But
a low wall, you could look over it.
A distance is, I think, depending on the situation, like for me as well, crucial. Depending on where you're coming from, where you're going, like you do need the space to answer those questions for yourself. But like you said, at some point it becomes more harmful to stay that way. And you have to evolve. And I think sometimes bringing, like you said, the good elements back as you can, where you want to, in the ways that work,
in your terms,
should be very empowering. In your terms. And then agency. It's a wonderful
agency. Thing. Yeah, it's very powerful. Wow. What were some things that helped you, or maybe not help, but what were some things that, as a teenager, as somebody who was, a budding, young adult, that made you kind of realize the indoctrination and look to the other way?
It's definitely closer to college for me. And, well, live music for sure. I would say, like, experiencing over the course of a period of time a lot of that, and all that goes with it, like the lifestyle, the people that you're interacting with, and starting to see these people that I thought were very good people that had very different beliefs. I was like, okay, wait, hold on. I thought that if you thought this way that you were bad, but like I'm talking to you, like I know you well, and you're not. You're cool and great and nice and like just all of the good things plus none of the bad things. I'm like, okay, okay. And after a while, that started to internalize a little bit more. And I think the most important thing was having not necessarily anybody that was going through the same thing, but having a friends and support network at the time that were making it, not making me feel bad for it, I guess is probably the best way to put it. I think that it could have gone very differently if I felt more like unwelcome in those environments. I think one of the great things about like club culture and especially electronic music and like some of the more like niche-based scenes especially are very inclusive, and I think it's great because it's not all like that. And I think that without that sort of openness from the community that I was engaging with, it would have been much easier for me to just retreat hard and to have that feeling of like, okay, actually bad people. And it was good because it took a while, it took like a lot of data points for the wheels to start turning. And then, eventually one day you wake up, you're like, oh, okay, I'm thinking very differently now than 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever.
Isn't that a crazy like realization?
Right.
When you can like differentiate between the new view and the old view, and because like when you're in the transition period, there's like a lot of questions, a lot of noise, a lot of things, and then all of a sudden one day you're just like, oh, I'm this person now, and that person was in Hebrew we have this term. Before. It's like you have dati, which is like religious, and then you have the flash, which is like previously religious, and it's like a term you would say to somebody, and like you and people and then you have like secular, which is like a completely different thing, but there's like this movement that you have with people that go from being religious to secular, where there's like the moment where they're a previously religious, where they're still almost not 100% secular, but they're like they're
put
seeing,
on both sides.
Yeah. So it's a very interesting kind of, roller coaster ride that people go through, I think, to kind of, because, and I don't hold any grudge against my parents. I think that they were just doing the right thing that they believed in. But, indoctrination is a fucked up thing. Like, it's so heavy. Like, it's so crazy how much it can meld your brain. And like, obviously we see it in society, right? Like, people are indoctrinated by so many things. But when it's heavily influenced by like good versus evil, which is a lot of what our parents were indoctrinated as well into this thing, it's so heavy in the psyche that it's almost like this epic kind of like, I don't know, I love Lord of the Rings, and like whenever I watch Lord of the Rings or think about Lord of the Rings, it's like this very epic good versus evil thing going on. And like, if Sauron wins, that's it. It's like the world is gonna end, and like that's kind of how I view it's like visceral. It's like a visceral feeling of like, if I do this bad thing, I'm going to go to hell, or I'm going to be a bad person. And it's like, it's like something that I think is very hard to retrain yourself into understanding. And what you said about the people is so potent to me, because that was the experience that I had of like seeing secular people, seeing people of other religions, of like, oh, this person has a completely different belief system, but they are so sure of it, the same sure of it that my rabbi was or my dad was. How could they, and they're good people, there's no way that both of those things can exist together. So either all the people that I know are wrong, or he's wrong and all his people are wrong, and then you're like, oh, wait a second, they're both the same thing. Everybody's right.
C.
It's what?
Yeah. They're option C.
Option C, exactly.
Yeah.
I don't know if this was like this for you as well, but you mentioned it very coyly, and I like that conscious expansion at parties. Whether it's with dance, dancing is extremely consciousness expansion. Whether it's with in the music dance scene, you can dance like a crazy person. You can dance how your body feels, and nobody's going to judge you. That's consciously expansion. And then obviously you have the substances that are consciously expansion. I feel like you also use these terms. I wrote them down. The emptiness feeling and the escaping feeling. I started getting into electronic dance music in Israel. It's psytrance mostly, and a little bit of techno during my army service, during my military service. And at that point, I was already 20. I had gone through the kind of machinations. I was religious previously, where I was kind of like, okay, I don't want to do all these things that I'm taught, but I still am stuck in this kind of like negative view of things.
Yeah.
And then the army comes into place, and it's like, blah, 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 blah. So I started experimenting with psychedelics and kind of this mind expansion in that moment. And the feeling of wanting to escape every weekend from the army, or the feeling of emptiness, of like hopelessness, was so strong during my life in that point that these experiences with electronic music and the community around it, and the spiritual mind awakening, conscious expansion that happens with it, was so important to my life. That I just don't understand. I don't know how I would have understood it differently or without that.
Don't think that I would have. I doubt it. I think, I mean, psychedelics are very important in my trajectory, both like for fun, for sure, but also for some very intentional, like, I don't think that I'm thinking the way that I should be, so I'm going to fix that work. That took a long time, but I was pretty intentional about, and I think ultimately it was very, very fundamental in kind of being able to make that switch. And like you said, realizing like, okay, now I'm a person who thinks differently than a person who I was before. And having the time, I think, each week to, like you said, express yourself just purely physically in like a no judgment space whatsoever. Like, you could be completely alone. I mean, like, with tons of other people, right? But like completely alone. And even though if you're there with your friends, like, everybody is doing their own thing. It's a very meditative experience in a lot of ways, at least for me. And I think I did a lot of processing and just like understanding in those circumstances. There's a lot of time to think over 6 hours, and you're just like, there's nobody to talk to. So you're just there, feeling, letting all the emotions wash through you. And I think the biggest thing for me was probably learning to let myself feel and express, and like let a lot of the guards that had been built up by a lot of that indoctrination slowly, very slowly, just like fall away. I remember like the very first music festival I went to when I came back to, I guess, college campus at that time. I was like, just like dancing as I was walking down the sidewalk. I'm like, what am I doing? I've never done this before in my entire life. But like,
it felt so good.
Why not? It felt so good. And, like, sometimes still just walking down the sidewalk, like, I'm just having a good time. And I think that the club environment, general, like, electronic music scene, festivals, all that stuff is very, very good for building the space that allows that kind of thing to happen. And that goes back to what I said at the very beginning, which is a big piece of why I want to do all of this, is to just have a similar type of space with a different flavor. Because while it was that for me, I know that it isn't that for everyone, and it can't be that for everyone. But I do think that immersive, especially interactive art exhibits, if done right and well, may provide some sort of similar reflective space, and hopefully enough presence of mind with the interaction and everything that maybe some new thoughts can arise. And I think that is very important to me because how impactful it was for my whole trajectory and self-development.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah. And that's kind of, you know, like we said it before, it's kind of like a big reason for a lot of us to do this is to help people and make them, you know, maybe get into a position where they can't get in their everyday life, especially if it's a corporate world or, you know, a commercial world. What do you think, you know, obviously you're very familiar with intention and kind of how powerful that can be, not on a foo-foo level of just like, you know, manifestation, which I personally believe in, but I understand how that can be foo-foo. But I mean, intention in math is a very strong thing as well, right? Like you can literally, you know, there's a whole study of, what's the word when you can make somebody think about something just by the words that you're using, enforcing or Inception, is that what that is? Inception?
Yeah.
So there's a whole thing of there, you know, what is, do you approach your interactions and installations with this idea of inception or, you know, kind of like the idea that the intention is wanting to help people?
No, not really. I think hit you with another quote. It is the listener who determines the meaning of an utterance. And what I take that to mean is I can say whatever I want, right? But you hear what you hear, and you don't hear what I say. You hear what you hear. And to me, that's very important. And when I read the body of work that included that quote, it was one of those kind of like state changes where it's like, oh, okay, I'm seeing like everything is in a different light now. This kind of inversion, which I think is very subtle but very powerful, is how I kind of approach these installations. So I do not think it is possible to say I will create this thing in the mind of a viewer. I don't even think it's really possible to say or advisable rather, to say I'm trying to create this thing in the mind of the viewer. The mind of the viewer, the user, you, me, like whatever is going to happen in there is going to happen in there. It's going to be completely unique to you or them based on their subjective experience, their past, what they're bringing with them, their mood, whatever. All of that is going to determine how they're processing. So for me, it's not about trying to do anything or even trying to help. All I want to do is try and maybe make a pause and allow that pause to be filled with whatever it's filled with. And I think in this day and age, especially, that pause is one of the scarcest resources that we have, increasingly vanishingly so. And so what I'm trying to do with this is simply create space for that pause, which, by the way, I think is what can occur when you're very present with something, which is why interactivity is important, because when you're in the middle of interacting, you're seeing and, you know, everything is all linked at once. You're like, oh, I'm moving. It's working. There's an instant where you are present. You're not thinking about anything else. When the light bulb goes off, you're just like, whoa, this is cool. That's really hard to come by. And I think that in and of itself is the only thing that I'm trying to do. And then whatever happens to the person who's able to take that pause is up to them. And I think that's also the beauty of our conscious experience, that everybody has their own. And another reason that why I think interactive installations are such a great medium to be moving forward with, just in art generally, because the interactivity and the way that each person can change their experience of the artwork directly, agency and interaction, is almost like a structural embodiment of that same concept, which I really like. Wow. So you kind of have a full circle thing going. But yeah, to answer it in a sentence, creating that pause and allowing the mind to fill it with whatever it's filled with is the goal for me.
I love that. I love that. That's so it's so potent in first of all in your work for sure, in the kind of, very abstract but also very directed abstraction that you do, with these kind of like fluid smoke kind of very beautiful picked kind of curated color patterns. The pause is very apparent, right? Because it's like you're not just playing with something. It's not like a game where maybe a game could be a pause. A game is more of an escape maybe because you're kind of like in another place. But here you're
A
kind
game
of
is
like,
a pause that's filled with something automatically, right? Because
yes.
game, it's next. It's the next turn, the next thing.
Mm,
So this is the excitement of the game without the filling in the blank, I
right.
think.
Your mind, your attention is the next thing, right? Is like,
Yes.
okay, I'm interacting, I'm playing, but nothing's happening, but something's happening, and then that's kind of like your internalization. Not nothing, but like the thing that's happening is just abstract. It's just like it's not like a game character coming and telling me go to the next level.
Yeah.
I think this is beautiful. I think this is like a very really nice springboard into kind of like where our world is going and kind of like where our industry in general is going, with the advent of AI. I'm sure you're aware of it. I also don't like to put AI on a pedestal. I think it's extremely overhyped. There's so much information out there of like how much it's overhyped and how much it's not necessarily what people are saying. When there's billions and billions of dollars being thrown around, people will say whatever you want. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but AR is always 3 to 4 years around the corner. And I work in an industry where we use AR all the time, but the glasses, I don't know if you saw Orion's glasses, Facebook's glasses, they're still in development. And they've been in development for fucking, the HoloLens has been out for almost 15 years.
I was going to say, Google Glass started in high school.
Yeah, Google Glass. Remember that? Oh my God, I forgot about that. But yeah, I mean, AGI is just around the corner, but it's like that's what they've been saying for years. And especially especially when you think about what generative art is and what machine learning is, we've been using that for years. So, but at the same time, it would be remiss to not accept the fact that, how much it is gotten to a level where it's very impressive. And whether it's, using ChatGPT, large language models for coding. I mean, I'm now a beginner level Python coder because of ChatGPT. And not only because I can prompt it, but because through prompting, I've learned to read code and understand it, which has been immeasurable, changed my life immeasurably. So, I think that offering people this experience that is, okay, it's still with a screen and you're still looking at a screen and you're still, interacting with some sort of machine. I think that when we can bring those down to the kind of conscious level, that we're kind of doing a really good service to humanity, and not to be like whatever, we're doing a service, but like in a cohesive way, and not in a obstruction way of like, trying to break down the walls of humanity or whatever. I think it's very important. Yeah, what has been your experience with AI, and do you have any views on it, or kind of what is your take? What is your take?
My take is, okay, so I started following all of this a long time ago, and I was because I had the math basis, right? Even when I was in college, neural nets and the more theoretical side of that was entering the discourse, at least it was already in the discourse, but it was getting to the point where as the college math student, you're just starting to talk about that stuff. And so I was always pretty interested, and a lot of what I was kind of teaching myself programming wise in the first part of my professional career was a lot of applied machine learning. In financial markets, whatever, just classic time series analysis, stochastic modeling, all the good classic stuff. lightweight neural nets, like whatever. And because of that, I have been able to keep more up to speed on kind of like the technical development than I otherwise would have been, which I've been very happy about. Because I do think that it's here to stay, obviously. And it's kind of crazy to try and argue otherwise. I think it's all about being able to learn how to use it on your terms. And I'm a pretty cynical guy. And so, especially when it comes to stuff like this, which is being increasingly co-opted into corporate products, right? Like, it's one thing if it's an open source community that's building a lot of this stuff, and that's how a lot of this started, you know, like, what is it, 10 years ago, right? All of the very kind of beginning phases of the neural networks and all of that stuff.
Google Dream and what was the other one? I love that one. The Style GAN. That was so cool.
Yeah, but like even before that, like the foundational, like this is how to build a machine learning algorithm. You know, like scikit-learn, Verflow, like
got you.
Just all of the libraries that were created with the open source ethos in mind to allow people to build this literacy and like actually understand what's going on. And I think it is an unfortunate development in the trajectory of generative AI, which has unfortunately been taken as an umbrella term for all of these applications. An unfortunate thing that is now moving off of the open source pipeline and into the product pipeline that's fueled by, you know, private equity and stock market returns and all these other things that are the bad people. Yeah, the people that I used to work for. And to me, that's sad. And I think that it is unfortunate because there's so much phenomenal application of this technology out there that gets like almost no press whatsoever. Even super simple stuff like MediaPipe or OpenCV.
Or MediaPipe, like, for sure.
Yeah. Just all of these things that are much less flashy, I guess, than the generative version that's newer to the scene, right? And I think it's unfortunate that the discourse has been somewhat polluted on the entire topic by just this new, flashy, highly invested in, but really narrow subset of all of the applications. And that is regrettable, in my opinion. I'm not super optimistic about what the current state of generative algorithms and where they're obviously going to go means for the integrity of the information ecosystem. I'd say that's my main concern. Like, there's a lot of moral stuff. There's a lot of like AGI sentience kills us all. Like, I can definitely argue that for sure, but I understand those are tail risks and like the probabilities are such that my guess is as good as yours, as good as anybody else's. The information pollution we're seeing, and that's happened in a year and a half.
Yeah. And even before AI, just with social media, it's like just, you know, now with AI, it's just going to get worse. You're right. It's exponential almost. Yeah.
Like you see Google results that are not accurate and there's no way to source them. There's a lot of those things going on. And for some reason, people are still trying to train these models on the outputs of other models, which from like an information theoretic perspective can't resolve and gain a function. And so anyway, to me, this all just trends into like a morass of content that is content and not art. What I think that generally means is that as artists, you have to learn to use these things as tools and to understand how to talk about their conceptual place and what you're doing and why you're using them. I think that I'm doing it because I can, or because it makes it easier, or because it's new, are very bad answers to the question of why. I think there are good answers, and I've seen good answers, and I'm by no means someone who's anti artificial intelligence or machine learning or anything. I use it. I love it. It's like some of the coolest technology that's ever been created.
Totally. In our lifetime, for sure.
I think the lack of precision that is popularly used to talk about it is a function of media propaganda, and that's just like making it difficult to have the actual important discourses. Like, how can we retain a true record of history when everything digital is potentially altered by an algorithm with no policing or physical ability to understand the inputs to the outputs?
Totally.
Like, to me, that's worrying.
Yeah.
Especially as generations turn over and there are increasingly fewer people around who have
Remember the
firsthand knowledge of a lot of concepts. And that kind of encryption of information through the course of history seems like it should be fixed by the digital revolution, but I worry that it might just be more precarious.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So anyway, that's got a little philosophical, but
no, that's what the point of this is. Yeah, I think it's really cool what you said, that it's like that's the whole point of the digital age, is to kind of like cement or solidify these things and make it like the information age, right? Here you have all the information, but then with the advent of this kind of like generative AI that can be not even nuanced, it's like just can be completely hijacked, by special interest or by indoctrination or propaganda, etc. That information age now becomes toxic and dangerous, and
and it would be one thing if, I don't know, the models were all open source with all the training inputs, and anyone that could buy enough compute could peer review the resources and the outputs. And that's how the scientific community's gotten along for, at least until very recently has gotten along. That would be one way to go about it. I'm sure there's problems to that solution. There's problems to all the solutions, but I think it is going to get weird in ways that we probably haven't really anticipated yet. Which is to say nothing of the whole like artistic production using these tools.
Right. Like the automation aspect of our world is going to change as well. And that's going to change.
Which has just made very explicit the line between art and content. And I think that line is going to become more and more delineated, but also is going to become wider, and content's going to become cheaper, and I think art's going to become more expensive.
Totally.
Because there's going to be fewer people that can afford to do it, but the people that care are going to need to pay for it.
Yeah.
And I don't know exactly what that means. It's definitely good for some, bad for others. I don't know. But I do feel like that's kind of how it has to go, because it's clear that the corporate world is going to leverage cost saving anywhere they can, because the artistic quality of the output was never
a worry for them. Yeah. I was listening to this
So that's...
No, please. And so?
No, that was the end of my thought.
I was listening to this really interesting conversation. I can't remember the podcast, but it was these two researchers. They're like these two guys. They have this book, AI Snake Oil, kind of like breaking down different aspects of like what's bullshit and not. And a really cool thing that they were saying was that the people that are funding all this, right, the corporations in the commercial industries, they just want to make a tool that can automate something. They don't care if that automation is actually right or wrong. And that's very dangerous, because what if they they would be happy to fire 100 people and have one algorithm do their thing, but that algorithm might do a way worse job than those 100 people, but they don't care because their numbers are just now lower.
Yeah.
And that's like a future that's like so scary, because who hasn't had the fucking most annoying thing ever where you call a call center and the robot voice doesn't know what you're saying and doesn't understand and just hangs up on you or whatever. And then, put that into like dams controls, or like whether electric centers or power centers or whatever.
Missiles.
Nuclear missiles for sure. But then kind of like the flip side of that is that they were saying that a lot of companies are saying they're using generative AI, but then it's actually cheaper to hire a person than it is to train a model, which is also was also mind blowing to me. That they're like, oh, we have an AI algorithm, and then it's actually some guy like going through and choosing between the 10 pictures, and it's like, what? But that's like toxic marketing, like it's just crazy.
Yeah, this self-driving car company that recently launched in California I think it was not hidden. It was just like well marketed. That, it was like self-driving AI, blah, blah, whatever. But it turns out that instead of having one dude drive the cars, they had to hire 1.5 people for every car to route it. And so they just had people and computers like, telling the car where to go, like at critical junctures, being like, no, you got to go left.
It's just so crazy because,
it all will get to a point where a lot of that stuff goes away. Like, I do believe that with enough time and resources, those errors become, Six
cheaper,
Sigma or something like that, very low probability. But there's going to be a really weird period of time that we're definitely getting into where people are going to be using it, like you said, and it's just going to be wrong. And it might not be like every time, but it doesn't really matter if it's your time that it ends up being wrong,
Totally.
Whether it's like, I don't know, running it over CCTV footage and I don't know. Don't even get me started on like surveillance-based pricing. That's a whole separate but very rapidly growing thing. Yeah, stores are starting to roll out these digital price tags so they can update prices faster. Like whatever. And they're starting to do, like a Walmart. It'll just have like a digital price tag. And so now they're starting to say like, okay, we're going to make groceries more expensive on Sundays because everyone shops on Sundays. But it's only a matter of time until your face get biometrically,
personalized,
detected, signed to your data, and all of a sudden they know that you like Cheetos and I like Doritos, so they're more expensive for me than they are for you.
It's like when you do a flight search from a local, or you do a flight search from a VPN, and the cookies are tracking you and seeing what your things are. I've had that happen to me many times when you do a flight search and then you wait 24 hours and you do the flight search and it's double the price for no reason. Same amount of seats are available. Everything's the same thing. They just know that you found, 10 different flights and you're not interested in any of them besides that one. Yeah, I mean, that's like very scary for sure. I feel like it's so crazy because all these things are solvable simply by like, by the government getting involved. And I hate the government. I'm all for small government. Yeah. But I think that at the same time, the beauty of the government or the function of the government is to solve these problems of making, standards and, not sanctions, but.
Well, let me ask you this. Who in the government, so like, I'm not a very political guy. I'm not making a political argument here. I'm making a government argument. Who in the government, this administration or the last one or the next one, do you think could fix that problem?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's like,
I'm not saying a single person. I'm just saying I feel like the government
but it's the same thing like rent control. Yeah. Right? Rent control was... And I think that you'd ask probably 90% of people would say rent control is a positive. Maybe like some realtor would say it's not a good thing. But 90% of people would say, especially in New York, you live in New York, rent control... Yeah. Imagine gentrification without rent control. It would be crazy. Yeah. It would be crazy. So... And look at San Francisco. There's a good example of gentrification without rent control. So I think that there are aspects of government that can make things somewhat, in some way, better. Who would do it? I don't know. You're right. Nobody understands that shit in government. They're all.
Yeah, and that's the problem. The technology is just moving faster than the legislative bodies can ever hope to keep up with, right? Like the only people that understand this at the scale and depth that would be required to intelligently legislate are the people building it.
Right, and they're not interested in government. Right? Those people
are the researchers, those people are paying. So, it
gets dicey very quickly, for sure.
Yeah, it gets dicey very quickly, and like I said, I'm cynical. I think those companies are probably finding the best researchers on the counter side of the aisle to pay to be on their research side,
Of course.
There are probably neuroscientists that I follow that are doing just that, and it's very sad.
Totally. Or lobbying the politicians to be like, don't worry about this thing. Don't worry about this thing. Focus on this thing.
Social media is not addictive.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's like the same, I love when people are like, oh, science, follow the science. Do you not remember? I mean, I don't remember, but do you not know that scientists said that cigarettes were good for you for decades?
Paid scientists. Very well
paid scientists. Or look at the food pyramids. Up until 15 years ago, food was thought of as completely backwards. And that was scientists, And then, we don't have to get into COVID or anything, but post-COVID, the scientists, most of them were lying. So, I mean, it's a funny thing that that we live in this kind of world where, I love science and I believe in science, but at the same time, there's like this cult behind science. Science became a religion almost, and, this dogmatic kind of idea of science is so scary and it's so backwards of what science is and kind of like the idea of science that it becomes kind of weird. So to not end the podcast on a negative note, let's shift into something completely different. And we're getting to the end here. What do you think about virtual reality, and kind of what do you think about multidimensional aspects of what virtual reality means? Like, where does the multidimensional aspects of virtual reality talk to you?
I think that I'm generally more on the AR side than the VR, probably. I see the applications for both of them. I get a little bit more hesitant about where the pure VR side leads if you take it to a technical and logical limit. But I think that augmented reality is pretty exciting, and there's a lot of very interesting things that are, like, I'm excited to see, I guess. Mm-hmm. For example, the Gaussian splatting and nerf technology or restoration pipelines, I guess, that have been developed, I think will be very key in building the digital landscape, digital whatever, like the implementation of the real world in the digital world to kind of support all of that augmented stuff. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that the ability to have different, let's say, assets or decision chains based on user-specific information also brings a lot of interesting questions and also stuff to play with into the artistic world too. I'm very interested to see how that all gets brought into like the new media interactive landscape. Like, if you get to walk in wearing these Orion glasses, like, what happens? And what happens if you and I are both wearing them? Like, I don't know. That's a great question. Probably something pretty cool. Mm-hmm. And so I'm thinking about integrating the technology into my workflow more as layers on top of what I've already got going on. I guess just like purely how I'm thinking about it for me, because then all of a sudden you have this still three-dimensionalized physical thing, right? But then you can have your digital layers over top, and there's no reason from an artistic perspective that can't be one more iteration of the blending screen space and world space, right? Like, it just gives you one more digital layer to play with, and that digital layer happens to be customized for every person, and also maybe oriented arbitrarily depending on the time. And those are just things that you have to design with in mind. But to me, that's like pretty exciting. I'm sure it'll be very difficult, but yeah, I'm interested to see where all that goes. Interesting.
And the more esoteric aspect of multi-dimensions and kind of other dimensions, what is your take on that? Do you have any opinion on that?
Can you expand?
I mean, like, kind of like quantumization of like, a particle here connects to entanglement with a particle somewhere else.
Connect that to VR for me. How does that work?
Because virtual reality or augmented reality is kind of a different dimension, right? It's taking the 3D dimension and adding to it a different layer, or it's augmenting, or it's changing the 3D dimension, and it's purely not 3D anymore. It's a different dimension. It's in your mind. It's just your optical nerves expressing something. It's almost like dreams, right? Like, dreams are not 3D dimension, but they represent themselves into a 3D dimension when you kind of experience them, but they're not, right? They're a different dimension.
Yeah. Okay, I'm not so sure I'm on board with this one. I think I see where you're going, and I'm of two minds on the whole many worlds hypothesis with quantum mechanics. I think it's most likely not really the structure of reality, most likely, but I'm not a quantum physicist, so That's just kind
in
of
your opinion.
me waxing. But the thing that you mentioned that I do think is very real, and the part that I find a lot more interesting, is the, let's say, forced emergence of specific sensations based on sensory input. And that's pretty interesting. That is, I think, from a pure virtual reality perspective, what I am most excited about, because there is, I think, a world in which, with the right sensory stimulus, you can probably create a lot of sensations.
Yeah.
Good ways, bad ways. I'm sure that shit can be used for fucked up things. Sorry.
I'm sure it already is being used.
Yeah, for sure. But I think it can be used for a lot of very good things too. And to me, whether or not you call that a different dimension or just making obvious the degree to which we process and filter our environment anyway, and drawing that, the fact that we author fiction every second of our waking lives into the forefront and kind of making that explicit is, I think, a very cool angle to take, and something that the VR world will allow us to do in ways that, like, maybe we just never even been able to think about before, especially once you start thinking about really nice high fidelity haptic integration. And they already have like the really nice auditory, like, waves through the bone,
spatial audio
kind of things. Yeah, eventually there's going to be some olfactory, like, sensory, I'm sure. You can probably find a way to just fake that somehow.
Well, I was in SIGGRAPH this year, and there was a bunch of haptic stuff for VR. You know, the Leap Motion, the super awesome hand tracker. They have one that shoots air on a array, and as you're interacting like this, then air is being shot to you in like a 3D array. So it pushes your hand, and then you get like resistance. And then I mean, that's like super cool. And then there was another one that was like it sat on your hand as like a bracelet, and then on your finger, and then as you're moving, it sent like small vibrations to your wrist that kind of mimicked holding something. It wasn't as good as the Air one, but it was like a super cheap, like it was like a $20 thing that you just put on. And it was like, you know, you're walking a dog, and in their demo, you're petting a dog, and it just vibrates, but the sensation, like, it vibrates over here, but it projects into your hand. It was very cool. Yeah. It was really cool.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I think that's like, you know, that's only going to get better with more precision, more higher resolution, like faster refresh rate, all that stuff. There's going to be some crazy installations in a couple of years, that's for sure. And I'm very excited to see it. I think the like the Air, especially, I've been following that development a little bit because it seems very positive.
Yeah.
Like, I like that entire line of research because I think you can also, with the right money and investment, scale it up to a person size, you know, especially in like a virtual production chamber.
Wow, that'd be cool.
Yeah. So I think there's some interesting interleaving that starts occurring, and then once we scale it all up, it's just gonna go pretty wild. Yeah.
Wow. Well, Lake, thank you so much for your time. This has been super fascinating. You're a really interesting guy, and I really appreciate you taking the time and effort to show us a little bit into your life and your work. And is there anything you'd like to share with us before we leave?
It's been a pleasure. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you for having me on. I am doing an exhibition in Miami during Art Basel in December. That's the next big thing I've got going. So
we'll have a link for
if anybody's around, come and check it out. It should be a pretty cool one this year. But otherwise, just say thank you again. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, it's a lot of fun.